The canyon walls trapped heat like a furnace baking the air until each breath scorched the lungs. Midday in Arizona Territory, summer of 1879, and even the insects had fallen silent in surrender to the merciless sun. Only the sound of boots striking loose gravel disturbed the weighted stillness as Marshal Reed Thornton ran, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Blood seeped through his shirt, where an Apache arrow had grazed his shoulder, not deep enough to stop him, but enough to leave a trail. 5 riders followed somewhere behind their horses, struggling in the narrow confines of the canyon. Reed had abandoned his mount 2 miles back when the path had grown too treacherous a decision that now gave him the advantage of maneuverability, but for how long? At 45, Reed's body no longer recovered with the resilience of youth. 15 years as a military scout and 5 as a marshal had etched lines into his weathered face and left scars both visible and hidden. The most prominent, a jagged mark above his right eye, caught the sunlight as he paused to listen for pursuit. Hearing nothing, he allowed himself 10 precious seconds of rest, pressing his back against the blistering rock wall. His hand moved instinctively to his canteen, shaking it to gauge the remaining water. Maybe enough for 1 more day if he rationed carefully. His revolver hung heavy at his hip, 5 bullets remaining, 1 for each pursuer if it came to that. But Reed had sworn 5 years ago, standing over his wife's grave, that he would not add more blood to his ledger if he could help it. The sound of distant voices spurred him forward. The canyon would open soon to a wide basin where he could find better cover. Just 50 more yards. 30. 10. As the walls finally relented and the horizon expanded before him, Reed's eyes caught movement ahead, something unexpected in this desolate place. A human form lay crumpled on the ground, barely visible against the sand-colored earth. Reed crouched low, suspecting an ambush. But as seconds passed with no attack, he inched closer. It was a woman, Apache by the look of her clothing. She lay unconscious in the full exposure of the sun, her face etched with exhaustion. One of her sandals had split apart, and dried blood caked the sole of her foot. She would not last another hour without shelter. Reed glanced back at the canyon mouth, then to the distant hills where he'd planned to seek refuge. The sound of pursuit grew closer. He faced a choice that would determine whether 2 lives ended today or continued on, and time was vanishing like water on hot stone. Cursing under his breath, Reed hoisted the woman over his shoulder. Her weight, slight as it was, sent fresh pain through his wounded arm. Gritting his teeth, he scanned the basin and spotted a narrow crevice in the rock face about 200 yards ahead. Not ideal, but it would have to do. By the time he reached it, sweat had soaked his shirt completely, and his vision swam with dark spots. The opening was barely wide enough for them both, hidden by a scrub that looked dead but might offer precious minutes of concealment. Reed eased the woman down first, then squeezed in beside her, drawing his revolver as the sounds of pursuit emerged from the canyon. 5 Apache riders spread out across the basin floor, scanning the ground for tracks. Their faces were painted for war, and Reed recognized the patterns of the Chiricahua band, known for their relentlessness in tracking enemies. One pointed to the ground, then to the blood drops Reed had left behind. The rider dismounted, examining the earth carefully. Reed's finger tensed on the trigger. If they found this hiding place, he would have seconds to make a decision that had haunted him for years: to kill again or to die. The thought tasted bitter in his mouth. He had done enough killing to last several lifetimes. Minutes stretched like hours as the Apache scouts circled the area. Finally, after a heated discussion, they remounted and rode toward the hills to the west, the very direction Reed had planned to go. Whether they had lost his trail or simply decided to anticipate his route, he couldn't be sure. but their departure bought him precious time. Reed holstered his revolver and turned his attention to the unconscious woman. Her breathing came shallow but steady. Dark hair fell in matted strands across a face that spoke of hardship beyond mere days of travel. Her buckskin dress, once finely crafted, now hung in tatters around her thin frame. With careful hands, Reed inspected her for injuries. Besides the bloodied foot, she appeared to be suffering primarily from heat exhaustion and dehydration. He reached for his canteen, hesitating only briefly before lifting it to her cracked lips and allowing a few precious drops to slip between them. "Don't waste it all at once," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "Long way yet to anywhere that matters." As the water touched her tongue, the woman stirred slightly. Reed prepared himself for her fear upon waking to find a white man hovering over her. He moved back as far as the narrow space allowed, giving her room to breathe when consciousness returned. It took nearly an hour before her eyes finally fluttered open, revealing depths of deep brown that instantly sharpened with alarm. She tried to scramble backward, but the rock wall prevented escape. Her gaze darted wildly, taking in Reed, the confined space, and finally focusing on his gun belt. Reed raised his hands slowly, palms open. "I won't hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "Found you out there. Brought you here." The woman's eyes narrowed in suspicion. She said something in Apache that Reed didn't understand, her tone carrying unmistakable fear despite the language barrier. "I speak some Spanish," Reed offered in that language. "Or English." Her expression changed slightly, calculation replacing some of the fear. After a long moment, she responded in halting English. "Why, you help." Reed considered the question. There were many answers he could give: duty, compassion, basic human decency, but the truth was simpler and more selfish. "Been enough death," he said finally. She studied him intently, as if trying to read truth or lies in the weathered lines of his face. Whatever she saw seemed to ease her fear marginally. Her gaze moved to the blood seeping through his shirt. "You hurt," Reed nodded. "Arrow, not deep." Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward the canyon entrance. "Apache follow you?" "Yes, headed west now." This information seemed to surprise her. She looked down at her torn clothing, then back at Reed with a question in her eyes. "They not follow for me?" Reed shook his head. "Don't think they saw you at all. Just me they want." The woman absorbed this tension, visibly draining from her shoulders. After a moment, she pointed to the canteen at Reed's side. "Water?" Reed passed it to her, watching as she took careful, measured sips, despite her obvious thirst, the discipline of someone who understood survival in this unforgiving land. "Got a name?" Reed asked, as she handed back the canteen. She hesitated before answering. "Takala?" "Marshall Reed Thornton," he replied, then corrected himself. "Just Reed now. Haven't worn a badge in 5 years." At the mention of Marshall, Takala's posture stiffened slightly. Reed didn't miss the reaction. Law enforcement had rarely been a friend to her people. Night was approaching the sky, fading from harsh blue to deep purple. Reed knew they couldn't stay in this crevice indefinitely. The Apache riders might circle back, and without water, they'd both be dead within days. "Need to move after dark," he said. "Cooler, safer." Takala glanced down at her broken sandal and torn foot. Reed followed her gaze. "I can carry you if needed." Pride flashed across her features. "I walk." Reed nodded, respecting her determination. He reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of leather he'd been saving to repair his own boots. With deft movements born of necessity, he fashioned a temporary binding for her sandal. "Won't last forever," he said, handing it to her. "But might get you a few more miles." Takala accepted the repair with a slight nod, not quite gratitude, but acknowledgement. As she worked the leather around her sandal, Reed noticed a distinctive scar on her wrist. A tribal marking he recognized from his scouting days. It belonged to a band that had been nearly wiped out in a military action years ago, an action he knew too well. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. The world of the Arizona Territory was vast, but somehow still small enough for paths to cross in ways that stirred old ghosts. Reed pushed the thought aside. Right now, survival demanded his full attention. The past would have to wait its turn. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they prepared to leave their temporary shelter. Reed checked his wound, binding it tighter with a strip from his shirt sleeve. Takala tested her repaired sandal, her face betraying no pain, though Reed knew each step must hurt. "Which way?" she asked, her voice stronger, now that the water had revived her. Reed considered. West was out of the question with the Apache riders headed that direction. East would lead them back through the canyon, equally dangerous. That left north toward more populated lands or south toward the border. South, he decided. There's a ranch about 30 miles from here. Man named Hayes, Thomas Hayes. He's fair to all kinds, might give us work, or at least water and rest. Takala's expression revealed nothing, but she nodded once. Together, they slipped from the crevice into the cool embrace of the desert night, two solitary figures against the vast landscape, each carrying burdens heavier than any physical pack could contain. They traveled in silence for hours, the moonlight casting long shadows across the basin floor. Reed set a careful pace, mindful of Takala's injury, despite her refusal to show weakness. His own wound throbbed steadily, a persistent reminder of how close death had stalked them both that day. Around midnight, exhaustion forced them to rest beside a large boulder that offered some protection from the night wind. Reed leaned back against the cool stone, his body demanding sleep, while his mind insisted on vigilance. "I take first watch," Takala said unexpectedly, her dark eyes meeting his. "You bleed. Need rest." Reed wanted to refuse old habits of self-reliance, dying hard, but logic overruled pride. He needed to conserve strength. "Wake me in 4 hours," he agreed, settling his hat low over his eyes. Sleep came swiftly, dragging him into troubled dreams. In them, he stood once more at Shadow Canyon, watching as soldiers under his command surrounded an Apache village. He heard again the orders from Colonel Blackwell. "No survivors. Make an example." In the dream, as in memory, Reed protested these were mainly women, children, elders. But Blackwell was unmoved. The nightmare shifted, and suddenly Reed was moving through the aftermath, stepping over bodies small and large. A child's doll lay splashed with red. A cooking pot still bubbled over a dying fire. And the silence, the terrible silence after the gunfire, stopped, pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. "No!" Reed jerked awake, his hand already on his revolver. Sweat covered his face despite the cool night air. Takala watched him from her position a few feet away, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Reed wondered how much he had said aloud in his sleep, how much she had heard. "Bad dreams," he muttered, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Shadow Canyon," she said softly. The name froze Reed's blood. So he had spoken in his sleep. He looked at her sharply, searching for accusation in her eyes, but found only a deep, measured assessment. "You know it?" he asked carefully. Takala nodded slowly. "My sister's village. I not there that day." Her English grew more precise, as if the subject demanded greater clarity. "White men came. Many died." Reed's throat tightened. The chances of this encounter, this connection, seemed impossible in a territory this vast. Yet here they sat, survivor and participant of the same tragedy, linked by blood, not shared, but spilled. "I was there," Reed admitted, the words scraping his throat. "Not as a soldier, as a scout. Meant to be peaceful meeting. Went wrong." It was a simplification that bordered on lie, but the full truth was too complex for this moment, too heavy for the fragile trust they'd built. Takala's people had attacked a stagecoach, killing 3. Reed had been sent to negotiate, but Blackwell had used the mission as cover for retaliation on a massive scale. Takala studied him in silence, and Reed wondered if she would try to kill him now, if this moment would end with one of them dead beside this nameless boulder. Instead, she simply said, "Dawn comes soon. We should move." Relief and guilt twisted together in Reed's chest. She hadn't forgiven him, how could she? But neither had she condemned him outright. It was a temporary reprieve at best, a complication at worst. They gathered their meager supplies and continued south, as the first hint of light touched the eastern horizon. The desert transformed around them, shadows retreating, as colors emerged: rusty reds, deep ochres, pale yellows, painting the landscape in fire hues. Beauty in a land that could kill with indifference. By mid-morning, heat had reclaimed its dominion. Their pace slowed as the sun climbed higher, Takala's limp becoming more pronounced, despite her efforts to hide it. Reed's wound had stopped bleeding, but ached fiercely, and thirst clawed at both their throats. When they spotted a lone mesquite tree casting precious shade, the decision to rest required no discussion. They huddled in its meager shadow, rationing the last of their water in tiny, insufficient sips. "Tell me," Reed said, finally breaking the long silence, "why were those riders chasing you?" He gestured in the direction the Apache band had gone. Takala's face hardened. "Not chasing me, chasing you. I meant to word before. You were alone in the desert, injured, running from something." She looked away, considering whether to answer. Finally she spoke, her voice flat with old pain. "My people cast me out. I am unclean to them." Reed frowned. "Unclean. I was taken by white men. 2 seasons. Made to work to—" She stopped, unwilling to detail indignities that Reed could imagine too well. "When I escaped, returned to my people, the elders said I carried white man's taint. Could not stay." The cruelty of it struck Reed hard. Takala had endured captivity and abuse, only to be rejected by her own people for surviving it. The injustice burned in his chest, alongside the thirst. "That's why you were alone," he said, understanding dawning. "No water, no food." She nodded once. "Better to die in desert than live where you are less than shadow." The determination in her voice spoke volumes about her character. Reed had known many who would have surrendered to such rejection, but Takala had chosen to face the merciless desert, instead had chosen to fight for life even when it seemed to hold no promise. "Your foot," Reed said, nodding toward her injury. "From walking, ran until sandal broke, then walked more." Reed reached into his pack and pulled out a small tin of salve he kept for blisters and minor wounds. He offered it to her without comment. After a moment's hesitation, Takala accepted applying the medication to her torn skin with efficient movements. "What about you, Marshal?" she asked as she worked. "Why Apache want you dead?" Reed sighed, knowing he owed her some truth in exchange for hers. "About a week ago, I stopped 4 men from taking an Apache girl from her father near Tucson. Shot 2 of them when they wouldn't back down. The others fled." Takala's eyes narrowed slightly. "You helped Apache." "Helped a child," Reed corrected. "Doesn't matter what color. Those men would have sold her, or worse. But you were Marshal then? Reed shook his head. No, just happened upon it. Haven't worn a badge in years. Yet you still say Marshal when giving your name, she observed with unexpected perceptiveness. Reed hadn't realized he'd done that. Old habits. Guess some things stick with you. Why you stop being Marshal? The question probed dangerously close to memories Reed kept locked away. He looked out at the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor, buying time. Made too many mistakes, he said finally. Led men where they shouldn't go. Followed orders I should have questioned. After a while, the weight of it gets too heavy to carry along with a badge. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Takala seemed to sense both facts, but didn't press further. As the day stretched on, they dozed fitfully in the inadequate shade conserving energy and moisture. By late afternoon, they faced a critical decision risk, continuing in the fading heat or wait until dark and travel with severely limited water. We go now, Takala said decisively. Night too cold without blankets. Better to reach water before strength fails. Reed nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her assessment. They set off again, moving slower than before, but steadily southward. The landscape gradually changed scrub brush, appearing more frequently, suggesting increased moisture in the soil. It gave Reed hope that they might find a water source before their canteen ran completely dry. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows eastward, Takala suddenly stopped. Reed followed her gaze to a distant plume of dust rising from the earth about a mile ahead. "Riders," she said quietly. Reed's hand moved to his revolver. "Get down." They crouched behind a large creosote bush, watching as the dust cloud resolved into the outline of 3 horsemen, traveling at a steady pace. Not Apache, their silhouettes suggested white men on American saddles. "Could be anyone," Reed murmured. "Prospectors, ranchers, or trouble." "All white men are trouble in this land," Takala replied without emotion. Reed couldn't argue with her assessment. Even good intentions had led to tragedy too often in the territories. The riders drew nearer, their features becoming distinct. 2 younger men flanking an older one, all dressed in the practical attire of working ranchers rather than the flashier garb of gamblers or gunmen. They rode with the easy confidence of men on their own land, unhurried and unafraid. "I think they're from Hayes Yee's ranch," Reed said, recognition dawning. The older one might be Thomas Hayes himself. Before Takala could respond, the wind shifted, and one of the horses nickered nervously, catching their scent. The riders pulled up, hands moving to weapons as they scanned the brush. Reed made a split-second decision. Standing slowly with his hands raised in clear view, he called out, "Just travelers here. No quarrel with you." The older rider studied them through narrowed eyes, taking in Reed's bloodied shirt and Takala's indigenous appearance. After a moment's consideration, he lowered the rifle he'd half raised. "You look more dead than alive, friend," he called back. "What brings you to Riverstone land?" "Thirst and hard luck," Reed answered honestly. "I know Thomas Hayes by reputation, hoping to find work at his ranch." The older man's weathered face creased in a cautious smile. "Then you've found him. Thomas Hayes, at your service." He glanced at Takala, his expression betraying no prejudice but clear curiosity. "Both of you looking for work?" Reed nodded. "Both of us." Hayes dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Up close, Hayes appeared to be around 60, his face lined with sun and experience, but his eyes remained sharp beneath bushy gray brows. "You're wounded," he observed, nodding toward Reed's shoulder. And both of you look like you've crossed half the territory without water. He unhooked his canteen and offered it. Drink. Then we can talk business. Reed accepted gratefully, but passed the canteen to Takala first. Hayes noted the gesture with quiet approval. After they had both drunk, Hayes introduced his companions, ranch hands named Miguel and Joseph, then asked, "Got names yourselves?" Reed Thornton. Takala. Hayes nodded, accepting the introduction without pressing for more. Ranch is about 5 miles south. Can you ride? Reed glanced at Takala, who gave a short nod despite the exhaustion evident in her stance. We can manage. Joseph, let the lady ride with you. Miguel, our friend here, can share your mount. The arrangements were made without fuss, and soon they were heading south toward Riverstone Ranch. Reed rode behind Miguel, his body aching with each movement of the horse, but relief washing through him at the prospect of water, food, and shelter. He glanced over at Takala, perched behind Joseph, her face betraying nothing of her thoughts. They had survived the immediate dangers of the desert, but Reed harbored no illusions that their troubles were behind them. The shadow of their connected past hung between them unresolved and potentially explosive, and the territory itself remained a powder keg of conflicting interests, Apache, Mexican-American, all vying for the same limited resources. As the first buildings of Riverstone Ranch appeared on the horizon, Reed wondered what new challenges awaited them in this temporary haven. Whatever came, he knew with certainty that the past would not remain buried for long. Some debts demanded payment, and some ghosts refused to rest until justice or vengeance had been served. The sun was setting as they rode into Riverstone Ranch, painting the modest collection of buildings in warm amber light. Unlike many frontier establishments that seemed hastily assembled, and temporary Hayes's property had the solid, settled look of a place built to last. A main house constructed of adobe and timber stood at the center, flanked by a large barn bunkhouse and various outbuildings. A corral held several horses that lifted their heads with interest as the riders approached. Beyond the immediate compound, Reed could see fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and further still fields of what appeared to be corn and beans stretched toward a creek lined with cottonwoods. Most striking to Reed was the composition of the workers visible around the property. Mexican vaqueros worked alongside white cowboys, and he even spotted 2 Apache men mending a fence, an unusual sight in a territory where racial divisions typically ran deep and violent. Hayes dismounted at the main house, motioning for the others to do the same. Miguel, stable the horses. Joseph, tell Catherine we have guests for supper. He turned to Reed and Takala. Let's get you both some proper care first, then food. Reed helped Takala down from Joseph's horse, noting how she swayed slightly before catching herself. Her endurance was remarkable, but even the strongest had limits. Hayes led them to a small building near the main house that served as an infirmary. Inside, simple but clean cots lined one wall, while shelves of medical supplies occupied another. My wife's domain, Hayes explained. Catherine trained as a nurse during the war. She'll see to your wounds better than any doctor in Tucson. As if summoned by her name, a woman entered the room. Catherine Hayes stood about 5 feet tall, her black hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical bun. Her skin was a warm brown, her features distinctly Mexican, though she spoke with no accent when she addressed them. Thomas, you've brought me work again. Her tone was gently chiding, but her eyes held warmth as she surveyed the newcomers. Siéntense, por favor. Let me see what troubles you bring. Reed sat on one of the cots while Takala hesitantly took another. Catherine approached Takala first, sensing her greater unease. I am Catherine, she said, switching to Spanish. May I examine your foot? Takala nodded cautiously. As Catherine gently removed the makeshift sandal repair, her expression remained professionally neutral, despite the severity of the wound revealed. "This needs thorough cleaning," she said, gathering supplies. "It will hurt, but infection would be worse." Takala sat stoically as Catherine worked only the slight tightening around her eyes, betraying her pain. Reed found himself respecting her fortitude more with each passing hour. Catherine then turned to Reed, examining the arrow wound on his shoulder. "Clean through, at least. Lucky. Still needs stitching." Reed submitted to her ministrations, gritting his teeth as she cleaned and sutured the wound. When she finished, Catherine stepped back, surveying them both with the satisfaction of a craftsman assessing completed work. "Rest now. Food will come soon," she said, then addressed her husband. "Thomas, a word outside." Hayes followed his wife out, leaving Reed and Takala alone in the quiet infirmary. Reed leaned back against the wall, feeling the day's tension begin to drain from his muscles now that they had reached relative safety. "Hayes seems decent," he observed. "Not many ranchers would welcome an Apache to their table." Takala's expression remained guarded. "His wife is Mexican. Perhaps he sees differently because of this." "Perhaps," Reed agreed. "Or maybe he's just seen enough hate to know it's a poor foundation for building anything that lasts." Takala studied him with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to strip away pretense. "You speak as if you understand this." Reed looked away. "Let's just say I've had time to reconsider many things I once took as truth." Before Takala could respond, the door opened and a young Mexican woman entered, carrying a tray with bowls of stew bread and 2 mugs of coffee. She set it down on a small table between their cots with a shy smile before departing. The rich aroma of the food reminded Reed how long it had been since he'd eaten properly. He and Takala fell to the meal with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, neither speaking until the edge had been taken off their appetites. "Good food," Takala commented, finally breaking the silence. Reed nodded in agreement. "Best I've had in months." They had nearly finished eating when Hayes returned now without his trail dust and hat. He pulled up a chair, turning it backward and straddling it with the casual ease of a man comfortable in his own skin. "So," he began without preamble, "Catherine says you'll both recover with rest and care. Question is, what then?" Reed set down his empty bowl. "Like I said earlier, we're looking for work. I can handle most ranch tasks, riding, roping, mending. Good with horses, too." Hayes nodded, then looked at Takala. "And you, miss?" Takala straightened slightly. "I can work with plants, know which heal, which harm. Can mend clothing, prepare food, tend animals." She paused, then added with quiet dignity, "I am strong. Learn quickly." Hayes considered them both for a long moment. Most ranchers wouldn't hire an Apache woman, especially these days, with tensions high. "And you?" Reed asked directly. Hayes smiled slightly. "I'm not most ranchers. I judge people by their work and their word, not by who their parents were." His expression grew more serious. "That said, I need to know if trouble follows you. Those wounds didn't come from cactus thorns." Reed exchanged a glance with Takala, silently negotiating how much to reveal. Finally he said, "I interfered with some men trying to take an Apache child near Tucson. They had friends who took exception to that. Been tracking me since." It wasn't the complete story, but it covered the immediate danger without diving into their more complicated connection to Shadow Canyon. Hayes nodded slowly. "Honorable trouble, at least. And you miss your own people, cast you out." Takala stiffened her face, closing like a shutter. "How you know this?" "I've lived in this territory 40 years, Hayes replied gently. "Seen it before. Some tribes reject those who've been captured, especially women." He sighed. cruel practice, born of cruel circumstances. Takala remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his assessment. Hayes stood, returning the chair to its place. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, if you're able, I'll show you what needs doing around here. Pay is fair room board and $30 a month, more depending on the work you take on. It was a generous offer by frontier standards. Reed nodded his acceptance. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Thomas, the rancher corrected, we don't stand on ceremony at Riverstone. After Hayes left, Reed and Takala settled into their respective cots as night deepened outside the small windows of the infirmary. The safety of walls, the fullness in their bellies, and the prospect of honest work ahead created a cocoon of temporary peace that made Reed's eyelids heavy. Just before sleep claimed him, he heard Takala's voice in the darkness. "Marshal," she said softly, "I know what happened at Shadow Canyon. Not all, but enough." Reed's eyes opened, sleep fleeing. "What do you mean? In your sleep you speak of Colonel, of orders refused, of regret." She paused. "I will watch. I will learn truth. Then decide." The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Decide whether to seek vengeance, whether Reed deserved to live or die for his role in the tragedy that had claimed her sister's village. "Fair enough," Reed replied finally. "But know this, whatever you learn, whatever you decide, I won't raise a hand against you. Those days are done." Silence was her only response, but Reed felt the weight of her assessment across the darkened room. As sleep finally claimed him, he wondered if he had just made a promise he would live to regret, or if he had already lived too long with regrets that no promise could erase. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of sunlight filtering through cotton curtains. Reed woke slowly, his body stiff but his mind clearer than it had been in days. The wound in his shoulder throbbed dully, but the fever that had threatened on the desert trek had receded under Catherine's care. Takala was already awake, sitting on the edge of her cot. She had washed and rebraided her hair, and someone, likely Catherine, had provided her with clean clothing. The simple dress and shawl were clearly Mexican in style, but fit her well enough. She looked up as Reed stirred. "Hayes, wait outside," she said. "Brings clothes for you, too." Reed nodded, stretching carefully to test the limits of his injury. "How's your foot?" "Better." She demonstrated by standing without apparent pain, though Reed suspected she hid discomfort behind her stoic expression. A knock at the door preceded Hayes's entrance. He carried a bundle of clothing and boots that he set on Reed's cot. "Thought you could use these. Belong to a hand who moved on last month. Should fit well enough." He glanced at Takala. "I see Catherine found something for you as well." Takala touched the fabric of the dress. "Your wife is kind." "She understands what it means to be between worlds," Hayes replied. "Her family crossed from Mexico when she was just a girl. Wasn't welcome in either place for a long time." He turned to Reed. "Get dressed and meet me at the barn when you're ready. I'll show you both around, see where you might fit best." After Hayes left, Reed changed into the offered clothing, sturdy work pants, a faded blue shirt, and boots that, while worn, were of good quality and nearly his size. He strapped on his gun belt more from habit than expected need. Outside, the morning revealed Riverstone Ranch in its full glory. What had appeared modest in the dusk yesterday now showed itself as a well-established operation spreading across several hundred acres. The main house, constructed of adobe with a wide porch, stood like a fortress against the backdrop of distant mountains. Workers moved purposefully between buildings, the atmosphere one of quiet industry rather than frantic activity. Reed and Takala made their way to the large barn where Hayes waited, speaking with a Mexican vaquero about horse lineages. He nodded as they approached, concluding his conversation. "Good morning. Hope you both slept well." Hayes gestured around the expansive property. Riverstone's been my home for 30 years now. Started with 50 acres and 12 cows. Now we run 2,000 head on 800 acres, plus crops and horses. Reed was impressed. Building something of this scale in Apache territory required not just hard work, but diplomatic skill. "How'd you manage peace with the local tribes?" he asked. "Most ranchers I know are in a constant state of war." Hayes smiled slightly. "By treating people like people, not obstacles, trading fairly, respecting boundaries." His expression hardened, "and making it clear that while I won't start trouble, I'll certainly finish it if pressed." They walked through the property as Hayes outlined the operation. The ranch employed 20 permanent workers from various backgrounds, white Mexican, and even 3 Apache men from a band that had reached an accommodation with Hayes years ago. "Labor's divided by skill, not color," Hayes explained. "Best riders work cattle, best farmers tend crops, best builders maintain structures. Simple as that." It was a radical philosophy in a territory where racial hierarchies were typically rigid and violently enforced. Reed found himself respecting Hayes more with each passing minute. They stopped at a field where corn grew in neat rows tended by workers of mixed heritage. Hayes turned to Takala. "Catherine mentioned you know plants, medicinal uses, growing conditions. That right?" Takala nodded cautiously. "My mother was healer, taught me. Our garden needs tending. Herbs, vegetables, some medicinals Catherine uses in her work. Would that suit you?" The offer clearly surprised Takala. Most ranchers would have assigned her to laundry or kitchen work regardless of her skills. "Yes," she said simply. "I can do this." Hayes nodded satisfied. "Catherine will show you what's needed." He turned to Reed. "As for you, I could use another experienced hand with the horses. Got a string of new Mustangs need breaking, and my best trainer broke his leg last month." Reed had worked with horses most of his life, finding their straightforward nature a relief compared to the complexities of human interaction. "Sounds good to me." As they headed back toward the main compound, Reed became aware of eyes following their progress, specifically following Takala. Some gazes held simple curiosity, others thinly veiled hostility. Hayes noticed, too. "Not everyone here shares my views on cooperation," he said quietly. "Most come around with time, others move on. Just be aware." Reed nodded, filing away the information. Prejudice could be as deadly as a gun in the wrong circumstances. They parted ways at the main house Takala to find Catherine and learn about the garden Reed to the corral where the Mustangs waited. As Takala walked away, Reed found himself watching her go, struck by the dignity in her bearing, despite all she had endured. Hayes noticed his gaze and commented, "Remarkable woman. Must have seen hell to be cast out by her people, yet still stands tall." Reed turned to the older man. "Why'd you really take us in, Hayes? Can't just be the need for workers." Hayes considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful. "When I came to this territory, I was angry, bitter. Lost my father to an Apache raid when I was 12. Carried that hate for years." He looked out across his ranch pride, evident in his expression. "Then I met Catherine. Her people had suffered under both Mexican and American rule. Made me see that hate just breeds more hate, never anything worth building on." He turned back to Reed, his eyes sharp with assessment. "I see something similar in you. Man who's carried burdens, made mistakes, but trying to set them down, start fresh." He shrugged. "Besides, everyone deserves a second chance. Even an ex-marshal and an exiled Apache." The words hit closer to home than Hayes could know. Reed wondered briefly if the rancher knew more than he let on, but Hayes was already moving toward the corral, the conversation clearly finished in his mind. The day passed in the rhythm of honest work. Reed found himself enjoying the challenge of the Mustangs, wild-eyed and suspicious, at first gradually responding to patient, consistent handling. By late afternoon, he had made progress with two of the more amenable horses, establishing the beginnings of trust. He caught glimpses of Takala throughout the day, working in the extensive garden near the main house. Even from a distance, he could see her confidence as she moved among the plants, clearly in her element. Catherine worked alongside her occasionally, the two women appearing to communicate well despite language differences. As the workday ended, ranch hands gathered at the bunkhouse for the evening meal. Reed hesitated, unsure where he and Takala were meant to eat, when Hayes appeared beside him. "Join us at the house for supper," the rancher invited. "After that, there's a small cabin behind the garden where you two can stay. More private than the bunkhouse, and better for healing." Reed followed Hayes to the main house, where they found Takala already seated at a large wooden table with Catherine. The interior was surprisingly refined for a frontier home: solid furniture, patterned rugs, bookshelves lined with volumes, suggesting a household that valued knowledge alongside practicality. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair of beef stew, cornbread, and fresh vegetables. Catherine engaged Takala in conversation about plants and their properties, while Hayes asked Reed about his experiences with different horse-breaking techniques. For a while, it felt almost normal, just people sharing a meal after honest work, no ghosts or grudges shadowing the table. As they finished eating, Catherine brought out coffee and a special treat, apple pie, made from the ranch's own small orchard. As she served it, Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "Need to tell you both something," he said. "Ryder came in while you were working. Brings news you should hear." Reed set down his fork, instantly alert. "What news?" "Colonel Emmett Blackwell is coming to Copper Springs, due to arrive in 3 days for some kind of territorial meeting." The name hit Reed like a physical blow. Colonel Blackwell, the man who had ordered the massacre at Shadow Canyon, who had threatened Reed with court-martial when he objected, who had covered up the true nature of the engagement in official reports. "Blackwell," Reed repeated, his voice hollow. "You're sure?" Hayes nodded. "Quite sure. He's retired from the Army now, owns the biggest spread north of here, Diamond B Ranch. Also has mining interests, political ambitions." Reed glanced at Takala, who had gone perfectly still at the mention of Blackwell's name. He wondered if she recognized it from his sleep-talking, if she had made the connection to Shadow Canyon. "You know this man?" Hayes observed, his eyes sharp. Reed chose his words carefully. "Served under him briefly during my scouting days. We disagreed on methods." "I've heard stories," Hayes said. "None particularly flattering to the colonel's character." Catherine spoke up, her voice gentle but direct. "Thomas, perhaps our guests would prefer not to discuss old military matters at the table." Hayes nodded, accepting the redirection. "Of course. Just thought you should know he'll be in the area. Copper Springs is only 15 miles from here, and Blackwell has business dealings with several local ranchers." The rest of the meal passed in strained politeness. The earlier ease evaporated with the mention of Blackwell. When they finished, Hayes showed them to the promised cabin, a simple one-room structure with 2 narrow beds, a table, chairs, and a small stove. "It's not much," Hayes apologized, "but it's clean and private." "It's more than generous," Reed assured him. "Thank you." After Hayes left, Reed and Takala stood in awkward silence within the small space. Finally, Takala spoke, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "This, Colonel, he was at Shadow Canyon." It wasn't a question, but Reed answered anyway. "Yes, he gave orders." Reed nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "He did." Takala moved to the small window looking out at the gathering dusk. "And you?" What was your part? The moment Reed had dreaded had arrived sooner than expected. He sat heavily on one of the beds, the weight of memory pressing down on him like a physical burden. I was the scout, he said finally, meant to arrange a meeting between Blackwell and the tribal leaders to discuss peace terms after some raids on settlements. He passed a hand over his face. At least that's what I was told, but Blackwell had other plans from the start. Takala turned from the window, her face illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. Tell me all, now. Reed knew he owed her the truth, however painful. Taking a deep breath, he began the story he had tried for years to forget. 5 years ago, Blackwell was commanding Fort Defiance. There had been raids on outlying farms, stagecoaches. 3 white settlers killed, livestock taken. Standard cycle of attack and counterattack that's played out across these territories for decades. He stared at his hands, remembering. Blackwell ordered me to find the band responsible, said we needed to negotiate terms, prevent further bloodshed. I tracked them to Shadow Canyon, small settlement, mostly women, children, elders. Only a few warriors. Takala's eyes never left his face as he continued. I reported back, told Blackwell it was primarily a family camp, not a war party. He seemed satisfied, said he'd bring a small delegation to talk peace. Reed's voice hardened. But when we returned 2 days later, he brought a full company of cavalry. Before I could even call out to the village, he ordered the attack. The memory flooded back with sickening clarity, gunfire, screams, the smell of burning wickiups, a child's doll trampled in the dirt. I tried to stop it, Reed said, his voice hollow. Drew my weapon, told the men to cease fire. Blackwell had me restrained, threatened to have me shot for mutiny. His hands clenched into fists. By then it was too late anyway. Most were already dead. Takala's face remained impassive, but her eyes blazed with a fire that spoke of contained rage and grief. After, Reed continued, Blackwell reported it as a decisive engagement with hostile forces, claimed the Apache had fired first, made himself a hero while I was transferred to civilian law enforcement, a marshal's badge to keep me quiet. He looked up at Takala directly. I resigned 5 years ago. Couldn't wear the badge, not after that. Been drifting since trying to... He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Trying to forget, Takala supplied, her tone cold, or trying to find peace. Neither seems possible, Reed admitted. Some debts can't be paid. Takala was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the deepening shadows of the cabin. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of carefully considered judgment. My sister died that day. Her son also. Many others I knew. She moved closer until she stood directly before Reed. In my dreams, I hear their voices calling for justice. Reed met her gaze steadily, accepting whatever came next. If you want my life in exchange, take it. I won't stop you. Takala studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. Death is easy, Marshal. Living with truth is harder. She stepped back. I will not kill you. Not yet. First, I will see what kind of man you truly are. Then, decide. It was both reprieve and sentence to be judged not by a single moment of failure, but by the sum of his actions now moving forward. Reed felt a weight simultaneously lift and settle differently upon his shoulders. Fair enough, he said quietly. Takala nodded once, then moved to her bed and sat with her back to him, effectively ending the conversation. Reed respected her need for space, for time to process all he had revealed. Outside, night had fallen, completely, stars emerging in the vast desert sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called a lonely sound that seemed to give voice to the ache in Reed's chest. He had finally spoken the truth he had carried for so long, but found no absolution in the telling. Perhaps there was none to be had. Tomorrow they would return to the rhythm of ranch work, to horses and gardens, to the simple tasks that anchored life in this harsh land. But beneath that ordinary surface, something profound had shifted between them. They were now bound not just by the chance encounter in the desert, but by the blood and tragedy of Shadow Canyon, a bond that would inevitably draw them toward either reconciliation or final judgment. As Reed finally lay down to sleep, he wondered which path they would ultimately travel, and whether either would lead to the peace that had eluded them both for so long. Dawn broke over Riverstone Ranch with the gentle persistence of light that had illuminated countless mornings across the Arizona Territory. Reed woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind, the unfamiliar ceiling, the comfort of a real bed after days in the desert. Then memory returned, bringing with it the weight of last night's confession. He turned his head to see Takala's bed, already empty, neatly made. The woman herself was nowhere to be seen. Reed sat up slowly, testing his injured shoulder. The pain had dulled to a manageable ache, Catherine's skilled ministrations doing their work. He dressed carefully, appreciating again the clean clothes Hayes had provided, then stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch was already alive with activity, horses being fed, cattle moved between pastures, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney. Reed spotted Takala immediately kneeling in the garden beside Catherine Hayes. Even from a distance, there was something natural about the way she worked with the plants, her hands moving with practiced confidence among the rows of herbs and vegetables. As if sensing his gaze, Takala looked up, her dark eyes meeting his across the yard. There was no warmth in that look, but neither was there the hatred Reed might have expected after his revelations about Shadow Canyon. Instead, he saw something more complex: assessment, calculation, perhaps even a grudging recognition that judging a man required more than knowing a single chapter of his story, however dark. She returned to her work without acknowledgement, and Reed turned toward the corral where the mustangs awaited. Hayes stood there, already watching a young bay stallion circle the enclosure with wary defiance. "Morning," the rancher greeted as Reed approached. "Sleep well." "Well enough," Reed replied, knowing Hayes wouldn't expect or believe a more enthusiastic assessment. Men like them measured sleep not by comfort, but by the absence of too many ghosts. Hayes nodded his eyes, never leaving the mustang. "That one there has spirit. Going to take a patient hand." Reed studied the horse, proud head, intelligent eyes, muscles rippling beneath a coat the color of mahogany. Best ones always do. They worked through the morning, Reed focusing on the mustangs, while occasionally catching glimpses of Takala in the garden. The physical labor provided welcome distraction from the thoughts that had plagued him through the night. Memories of Shadow Canyon, questions about Blackwell's presence in the territory, uncertainty about Takala's ultimate judgment. By midday, Reed had made progress with the bay stallion, not breaking its spirit, but beginning the long process of building trust. As he led the horse back to its stall for water and rest, Hayes approached. "Copper Springs has a supply store we need to visit," he said without preamble. "Seed for winter wheat, some tools, medicine for Catherine's work. Thought you and Takala might come along, get what you need as well. First wages in advance." Reed considered the proposition. Copper Springs was the nearest town 15 miles north, and also where Blackwell would soon arrive. The timing seemed deliberate on Hayes's part. "You sure that's wise?" Reed asked. "Blackwell isn't due for 2 more days," Hayes finished. "Besides, a man can't hide forever, especially in territory this small. Better to know what you're facing than live in fear of shadows." There was wisdom in that, however uncomfortable. Reed nodded slowly. I'll need to talk with Takala. Her decision, too. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. Fair enough. Leaving in an hour if you're coming. Taking the wagon. Reed found Takala still in the garden, now alone, as Catherine had returned to the house. She was separating plants into different bundles, her movements methodical and precise. Hayes is going to Copper Springs for supplies, Reed said without greeting. Asked if we wanted to join him. Takala's hands paused briefly in their work before resuming. You want to go? Need to eventually. We both need proper clothing supplies of our own. And, he hesitated, Blackwell will be there in a few days. Might be useful to know the lay of the land before then. She looked up at him sharply. You seek this man after what he did. Reed considered his answer carefully. Not seeking, but not running either. He's here for a reason, and knowledge is safer than ignorance. Takala studied him, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she nodded. I will go, but not to face your colonel yet. To understand this place, these people. She gathered her bundles of plants and stood. When we leave, within the hour, Hayes is taking the wagon. I will be ready. She turned to go, then paused. Marshal, if this Blackwell sees you, recognizes you what, then? It was a question Reed had asked himself throughout the sleepless hours of the night. Then I face whatever comes, he answered simply. Takala held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once before walking away, leaving Reed to wonder if she saw courage in his response or merely resignation. An hour later, they departed Riverstone Ranch in Hayes's sturdy wagon. The rancher handled the reins himself, with Reed and Takala seated in the bed among empty crates that would return filled with supplies. Catherine had provided them with a small basket of food for the journey and clean bandages for their still healing wounds. The road to Copper Springs followed a shallow arroyo for several miles before climbing into rolling grasslands dotted with juniper and piñon. Though not as harsh as the desert basin where Reed had found Takala, it was still unforgiving country, beautiful in its stark simplicity, but quick to kill the unprepared or unwary. For the first few miles they traveled in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts. Eventually, Hayes spoke, his voice carrying easily over the creak of wagon wheels. Been meaning to ask how'd you two come to be traveling together. Unusual pairing in these parts. Reed glanced at Takala, who gave a small nod, permitting him to answer. Found her collapsed in the desert, he said simply. Couldn't leave her there. Hayes nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already surmised. And before that, you mentioned trouble near Tucson. Reed provided a shortened version of the encounter with the men trying to take the Apache child and his subsequent flight from those seeking retribution. He left out Shadow Canyon entirely, and Hayes, though his sharp eyes suggested he sensed the omission, didn't press. Territory's changing, the rancher observed, not all for the better. More settlers coming in, more pressure on the tribes, more men looking to profit from the chaos. He shook his head. Men like Blackwell. Reed's attention sharpened. You know him personally. Met him a few times at territorial meetings. Man carries ambition like others carry a watch, always checking, it always aware of its ticking. Hayes spat over the side of the wagon. Owns the biggest spread north of here, the Diamond B. Started buying up land after he left the army. Now he's got fingers in mining, railroads, politics. Sounds like he's done well for himself, Reed commented neutrally. Hayes gave him a sidelong glance. Some men measure success by what they build, others by what they take. He flicked the reins gently, urging the horses over a rocky patch. Blackwell's the taking kind. They crested a small rise, and Copper Springs came into view in the valley below, a modest collection of buildings arranged around a central street, with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding landscape. Unlike many frontier towns that seemed temporary by design, this one had the beginnings of permanence. Several structures built of stone rather than wood, a church steeple rising above the other rooftops, even a few trees planted along the main thoroughfare. "Town's grown," Hayes commented. "New buildings since my last visit." He pointed to a large structure under construction at the north end. "That'll be Blackwell's Hotel, I'd wager." Man doesn't just visit places he invests in, them makes them his. As they approached the outskirts, Reed noted other details, a cavalry patrol passing through indicating the presence of a nearby fort. Several Apache families camped at a respectful distance from town, likely there to trade. And the usual assortment of saloons, livery stables, and merchants that formed the backbone of any frontier settlement. Hayes guided the wagon to a hitching post outside a general store with a hand-painted sign reading, "Wilson's Goods and Sundries." He set the brake and turned to his companions. "Might be best if we split up," he suggested. "Less conspicuous. I'll handle the ranch supplies. You two get what you need." He reached into his pocket and extracted 2 $10 gold pieces, handing one to each of them. "First week's wages in advance. Meet back here in 2 hours." Reed pocketed the coin with a nod of thanks. It was more money than he'd had in months, and more than generous for a week's work. Takala examined her coin with careful fingers before securing it in the pocket of her borrowed dress. "People here," she said, gesturing toward the town with a slight tilt of her head, "how they see Apache woman?" It was a practical question. In some towns, her very presence might provoke hostility, or worse. "Copper Springs is better than most," Hayes answered honestly. "Trading post before it was a town, so there's history of commerce with the tribes. Still," he hesitated, "might be easier if you stick with Reed, present yourselves as working for Riverstone." Takala nodded, absorbing the advice without visible reaction to its necessity. They parted ways at the general store, Hayes heading inside, while Reed and Takala continued down the main street. Reed was acutely aware of the glances they attracted, not outright hostility, but the cautious assessment of a frontier community noting strangers in their midst, particularly an armed white man in the company of an Apache woman. "Where first?" Takala asked quietly. Reed considered. "Clothing store there. You need proper boots, not just sandals. I could use another shirt, maybe a coat for when winter comes." The shop was modest but well-stocked, catering to the practical needs of ranchers and settlers rather than fashion. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from welcome to wary assessment when he spotted Takala. "Help you folks?" he asked, voice carefully neutral. "Need some basics," Reed replied. "Working at Riverstone Ranch." The mention of Hayes' establishment visibly relaxed the shopkeeper. "Friends of Thomas are welcome here. What are you looking for?" Reed listed their needs while Takala examined the merchandise with quiet interest. The proprietor, whose name was Jenkins, proved surprisingly helpful once his initial wariness faded. He found boots that fit Takala well, sturdy, but not too heavy, and located shirts, trousers, and a serviceable coat for Reed. When Takala expressed interest in fabric to make her own clothing, Jenkins showed her several options without condescension. As they made their selections, the bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. Reed glanced up to see a tall man in a cavalry officer's uniform enter, accompanied by 2 civilians in expensive Eastern suits. Something in their bearing and ingrained authority that expected deference immediately put Reed on alert. Jenkins straightened his manner, becoming more formal. "Major Ellis, good morning to you, sir." The officer nodded curtly. "Jenkins, I need to see those land maps you mentioned having." Colonel Blackwell's associates here are interested in property boundaries north of town. At the mention of Blackwell, Reed turned slightly away, adjusting his hat to shadow his face while continuing to observe from the periphery of his vision. Takala had also gone still, her expression carefully blank, as she pretended absorption in examining a bolt of cloth. "Of course, sir," Jenkins replied. "They're in the back room. If you'd care to follow me." As the men disappeared into a rear office, Reed exchanged a glance with Takala. "Let's finish up quickly," he murmured. They completed their purchases efficiently, Jenkins's assistant wrapping their selections in brown paper parcels tied with string. As they prepared to leave, voices from the back room grew louder, fragments of conversation carrying clearly. "Colonel Blackwell's offer is more than generous. These Apache claims are legally meaningless. Perfect location for the rail spur." Reed didn't linger to hear more, ushering Takala out onto the boardwalk, where they stood blinking in the sudden brightness after the shop's dim interior. "Blackwell's men already here," Takala observed quietly. Reed nodded, adjusting their parcels. "Talking about land and railroads, never a good combination for your people." "Or yours?" she replied pointedly. "Unless you are a rich man with friends in government." It was a fair assessment. In the territories, progress was often measured by how efficiently resources could be extracted and transported east, whether those resources were minerals, timber, or land itself. Those who stood in the way, whether indigenous tribes or small ranchers, were typically swept aside by the machinery of expansion. They continued down the street, purchasing other necessities, a knife for Takala to replace one lost in her exile ammunition, for Reed's revolver, basic medical supplies to tend their healing wounds. Throughout, Reed maintained a watchful awareness of their surroundings, noting the cavalry patrol that passed through town twice during their shopping. The whispered conversations that followed their progress, the speculative glances from saloon doorways. Near a small cafe, they paused, the aroma of coffee and fresh bread reminding them both that they hadn't eaten since dawn. Reed hesitated, uncertain of how Takala would be received in such an establishment. "Hungry?" he asked. She nodded, though wariness shadowed her eyes as she regarded the cafe entrance. "Wait here," Reed suggested. "I'll see if they'll serve us, or at least sell something to take away." Before he could enter, however, the cafe door opened, and a woman stepped out, Catherine Hayes, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She smiled warmly upon seeing them. "Perfect timing," she greeted. "I was hoping to find you both. Thomas is still haggling over seed prices." She lifted the basket. "I brought lunch. There's a small park by the church where we can sit." Relief flickered across Takala's features, though she quickly masked it behind her usual stoic expression. Reed, too, felt grateful for Catherine's timely appearance and considerate foresight. They followed her to a modest green space beside the white-painted church, where a few benches sat beneath cottonwood trees that offered welcome shade. Catherine spread a cloth over one bench and began unpacking her basket, fresh bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a jar of cool tea. As they ate, Catherine quietly pointed out various landmarks and personages of Copper Springs, the mayor's house on the hill. The doctor whose services supplemented her own medical work at Riverstone, the banker who had recently arrived from Denver with ambitious plans for the growing settlement. "Town's changing," she noted, echoing her husband's earlier observation. "When we first came to this territory, Copper Springs was just a trading post and a saloon. Now look, bank, school, 3 churches competing for souls." She shook her head, a mixture of amusement and melancholy in the gesture. "You don't approve?" Reed asked. Catherine considered the question. "Growth itself isn't good or bad. Depends on who benefits, who's pushed aside." Her gaze drifted to the edge of town where several Apache families had established a temporary camp. Some call it progress, when what they really mean is profit. It was a perspective rarely voiced so plainly in frontier communities where manifest destiny was treated as both inevitable and righteous. Reed found himself appreciating Catherine's clear-eyed assessment of the territory's transformation. Takala, who had been listening silently, suddenly tensed. Reed followed her gaze to see a group of horsemen approaching the town from the north. Perhaps a dozen riders led by a figure whose military bearing was evident even at a distance. Catherine had noticed as well. "Blackwell," she said softly. "2 days early." Reed instinctively reached for his revolver, then forced his hand back to his side. Running or fighting would only draw attention they couldn't afford. Besides, at this distance, it was unlikely Blackwell would recognize him after 5 years. "We should find Hayes," he suggested, keeping his voice calm despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "Time to head back to Riverstone." Catherine nodded, gathering their lunch things with efficient movements. "Thomas will be at Wilson's by now. We can circle around through the back streets." They stood to leave, but it was already too late. The riders had reached the main street and were dismounting in front of the town's largest saloon, directly in their line of sight. The leader, Colonel Emmett Blackwell himself, stood in his stirrups for a moment, surveying the town like a general assessing a battlefield. Even at 55, Blackwell cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full beard now streaked with gray, and eyes that missed nothing. He had exchanged his military uniform for the attire of a successful rancher, but the authority in his bearing remained unmistakably that of a commander. As if drawn by some sixth sense, those calculating eyes swept over the park and locked directly on Reed. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, recognition flickered across Blackwell's features, followed by something darker. Anger, perhaps, or the cold calculation of a predator sighting potential prey. Then his attention was claimed by the town's mayor, who had hurried out to greet the influential arrival, and the moment passed. But the damage was done. Blackwell had seen Reed, had recognized him. Whatever peaceful existence they might have hoped for at Riverstone had just become considerably more complicated. "Move now," Catherine urged quietly. "Quickly, but not running. I know a way through the alleyways." They followed her lead, Reed fighting the instinct to look back, to confirm whether Blackwell was watching their retreat. Takala walked beside him, her posture tense, but controlled her eyes, scanning continuously for threats. Catherine led them through narrow passages between buildings across a small creek that ran behind the town, and finally to the general store where Hayes waited with the loaded wagon, his expression darkening as he took in their hasty approach. "Blackwell?" he asked simply. Reed nodded. "Arrived early. Saw us." Parties didn't waste a time with questions. "Get in the back. Cover yourselves with the empty grain sacks if we pass them on the road." They climbed aboard, quickly settling among the supplies, while Catherine took her place beside her husband on the driver's seat. Hayes clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward, leaving Copper Springs behind at a pace just short of suspicious haste. For several miles they traveled in tense silence, Reed's mind racing with implications and possibilities. Blackwell's early arrival couldn't be coincidence, not after the conversation they'd overheard about land deals and railroad spurs. The colonel had always possessed a keen strategic mind, and Reed had no doubt he was positioning himself to capitalize on the territory's development. The question was whether Blackwell would consider Reed a threat to those ambitions and what he might do about it. As if reading his thoughts, Takala spoke quietly from beside him. "This man, he knows you now. What he will do—" Reed considered the question carefully. "Depends on what he's planning. If it's just business as usual, he might ignore me. If he's involved in something he doesn't want examined too closely." He left the thought unfinished. "And Shadow Canyon, he fears you speak of this, maybe." Reed stared at the road behind them, still empty of pursuit. Military record says it was a justified engagement with hostile forces. My testimony could contradict that. Hayes, overhearing, glanced back at them. Shadow Canyon. He repeated the name, clearly registering. That was the Apache settlement wiped out about 5 years back. Military claimed they were attacked, first defended themselves. Reed met the rancher's searching gaze. That's the official story. But not the truth. Hayes surmised, his expression grim. You were there. I was the scout. Blackwell was in command. Reed saw no point in hiding it now. There was no attack from the Apache. It was a massacre, plain and simple. Catherine turned on the seat, her face pale but composed. Those people mostly women and children, wasn't it? That's what we heard, though. The army denied it. Reed nodded, the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. I tried to stop it. Failed. Hayes was silent for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. Finally, he asked, And you, Takala? What's your connection to all this? Takala lifted her chin slightly. My sister and her son died there. Many I knew. The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Hayes and Catherine exchanged a glance, laden with unspoken communication born of years together. Yet, you two travel together, Hayes observed. Interesting choice. Reed had no response to that, and apparently neither did Takala. The complexity of their relationship, captor and rescued perpetrator and victim, two souls bound by tragedy and chance, defied simple explanation. They continued in silence until Hayes spoke again, his tone deliberately lighter. Well, whatever brought you together, and whatever Blackwell may want, you've got a place at Riverstone for as long as you need it. Man's reach doesn't extend to my land. The assertion carried both generosity and defiance. Hayes clearly understood the risk he was taking by sheltering them, yet offered it anyway. Reed felt a surge of gratitude toward this principled rancher, who had extended hospitality when most would have turned them away. Thank you, he said simply. Both of you. Catherine smiled gently. Riverstone has always been a haven for those needing a fresh start. It's the foundation Thomas built it on. As the wagon rolled steadily south, the tension gradually eased. No riders appeared on the horizon behind them, and the familiar landmarks of Riverstone territory began to emerge. By late afternoon, they passed through the ranch gates, the homestead buildings a welcome sight after the strain of the trip to town. Hayes pulled the wagon to a halt in the yard, and the ranch hands came to help unload the supplies. Miguel Joseph and the others worked efficiently, carrying seed bags to the storehouse, tools to the workshop, and medicine to Catherine's infirmary. Throughout, Reed noticed the quiet cooperation between workers of different backgrounds, white, Mexican, Apache, all focused on the common purpose of maintaining the ranch. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, Hayes approached Reed and Takala, where they stood sorting their own purchases. Join us for supper, he invited. There's matters we should discuss in private. The main house was quiet when they entered the regular ranch hands, taking their evening meal in the bunkhouse. Catherine bustled about the kitchen, laying out a simple but hearty supper of beef stew, cornbread, and fresh vegetables from the garden Takala had been tending. They ate first in companionable silence, the events of the day having sharpened appetites. When the edge of hunger had been blunted, Hayes leaned back in his chair, regarding Reed and Takala with thoughtful eyes. So, he began, without preamble, Blackwell saw you in town. Question is, what happens next? Reed considered carefully. Hard to say. Might do nothing if he's focused on other matters. Might send men to investigate why I'm here. Might come himself. And if he does, Hayes pressed, What's his quarrel with you exactly, beyond your knowledge of Shadow Canyon? Reed hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. After the massacre, I was outspoken about what happened. Blackwell had me transferred to Marshal Service to keep me away from military channels, but made it clear there would be consequences if I shared my version of events. Threatened you, Hayes translated bluntly. Essentially, said no one would believe a scout over a decorated colonel anyway. Reed's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. He was probably right. Catherine spoke up, her voice gentle but direct. And in the 5 years since you've kept silent. Reed nodded. What good would it do? The dead can't be brought back, and Blackwell only grew more powerful after leaving the army. Now he's a landowner, businessman, political force in the territory. Truth has its own power, Catherine observed quietly. Sometimes, Reed agreed. Other times, it just gets more people killed. Hayes drummed his fingers on the table, thinking, whatever Blackwell may want, you both have a place here for as long as you need it. But we should be prepared. For what? Takala asked, speaking for the first time since they'd sat down. For Blackwell to make some move, Hayes explained. Man like that doesn't leave loose ends lying about, especially not with his political ambitions. Reed frowned. Political ambitions. Word is he's positioning himself for territorial governor when Arizona moves toward statehood. Been cultivating friends in Washington, building alliances with business interests. Hayes shook his head. Man with blood on his hands, seeking power tale as old as time. The information settled uncomfortably in Reed's mind. Blackwell, as governor, would have even greater ability to bury the truth about Shadow Canyon and more motivation to silence those who knew it. Perhaps we should leave, Takala suggested pragmatically. Not bring trouble to your home. Hayes waved away the suggestion. Riverstone has weathered worse than Emmett Blackwell. Besides, running just postpones the inevitable. Better to stand your ground on friendly soil. Catherine touched her husband's hand. Thomas, perhaps we should tell them about the other matter. The news from the Apache camps. Hayes nodded gravely. Catherine's right. While in town today, I spoke with some contacts. There are rumors circulating among the Apache bands. Disturbing ones. Reed tensed. What kind of rumors? Several families have gone missing from the smaller camps. At first, people assumed they'd joined other bands or moved to the reservation, but too many too suddenly. Hayes leaned forward. There's talk of riders taking people in the night. Not killing them, taking them. Slavers, Reed asked, disgust evident in his tone. Possibly. Though slavery's officially outlawed, there's still a market for labor in the mines in certain ranches further south. Hayes looked at Takala. Thought you should know since your people are being targeted. Takala's expression had grown very still, her eyes reflecting a deep, controlled anger. When did this begin? Reports go back about 3 months. Coincides with increased mining activity north of here. Hayes hesitated. And with Blackwell's expansion into mining interests. Reed's eyes narrowed. You think Blackwell is involved? I think it's a remarkable coincidence that Apache people start disappearing around the same time Blackwell needs labor for his silver mines. Hayes replied carefully, but I have no proof. Just whispers and timing. The possibility hung in the air like a thundercloud, dark, ominous, carrying the potential for destruction. If Blackwell was indeed behind the disappearances, it represented a level of ruthlessness beyond even what Reed had witnessed at Shadow Canyon. We need more information, Reed decided, before making any move. Hayes nodded in agreement. My thoughts exactly. I have some contacts among the Apache bands that trade with Riverstone. They might know more. Takala spoke up, her voice measured despite the emotion evident in her eyes. My people may not speak freely to white man, even one they trade with. I should go with you. Risky, Reed cautioned. You're in exile. If they recognize you, some bands more strict than others, she countered. Trading bands often more practical, and they will talk to woman when not to man. Hayes considered her proposal. She has a point, Reed, and if these disappearances continue, more families will suffer. Reed couldn't argue with that. Whatever his personal concerns about Blackwell, the possibility that the colonel was organizing the abduction of Apache people for forced labor demanded investigation and, if proven, true action. When? He asked simply. Tomorrow, Hayes decided. There's a trading band camped about 10 miles east of here. We'll ride out at dawn. As the meeting concluded, and they prepared to return to their cabin, Reed found himself watching Takala. The news about the disappearances had clearly affected her deeply, despite her outward composure. Whatever her personal feelings toward her people after their rejection, she still cared about their welfare. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars spreading across the vast desert sky in brilliant profusion. They walked in silence toward their cabin, each absorbed in private thoughts, until Takala spoke. If Blackwell takes my people for mines, this is worse than killing in battle. Reed nodded somberly. Slow death instead of quick, and profit from suffering. Yet law does nothing. Law out here is whatever men with power say it is, Reed replied bitterly. Always has been. They reached the cabin and entered the small space, now feeling more familiar after their brief residence. Takala lit the lamp, while Reed stacked their purchases on the table. Tomorrow we will know more, she said, sorting through the fabric she had bought to make her own clothing. Then decide. Decide what? Her dark eyes met his, resolute and clear. Whether your colonel must die. The blunt declaration hung in the air between them. Reed had considered the possibility himself, had even dreamed of putting a bullet in Blackwell after Shadow Canyon. But the reality of such an act and its consequences was far more complicated than the fantasy of vengeance. Killing Blackwell won't end the problems he represents, Reed said carefully. Another man would take his place, continue his operations. Besides, he has men connections protection. So we do nothing, Takala challenged. I didn't say that. Reed ran a hand through his hair, thinking. But we need to be smart. Find evidence of what he's doing. Maybe bring that evidence to the territorial authorities, or even to Washington. Takala's expression made clear her skepticism about official justice, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she turned back to her fabric fingers, moving methodically as she measured and planned. Reed watched her for a moment, struck by the contradictions she embodied, fierce yet gentle, angry yet controlled, exiled, yet still loyal to her people's welfare. In the soft glow of the lamp, her profile was etched with a dignity that hardship had tempered, rather than broken. "Why didn't you kill me?" he asked suddenly. "When you learned about Shadow Canyon, you had every right." Takala's hands stilled. For a long moment she didn't answer, didn't even look at him. Then slowly she set aside her work and turned to face him fully. "In my people's stories," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of tradition, "there is tale of two wolves inside each person. One wolf is vengeance, anger, fear. The other is compassion, truth, peace." She held his gaze steadily. "The wolf that grows stronger is the one you feed." "And which are you feeding?" Reed asked quietly. "I do not know yet." Her honesty was unflinching. "Each day I decide again. But I know this killing you would feed first wolf, make it stronger. And I have seen too much death already." The simple wisdom of her response struck Reed deeply. In his years of drifting since Shadow Canyon, He had been feeding his wolf of guilt and regret, allowing it to consume him from within. Perhaps there was another path, not forgetting the past, but not being defined by it either. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your honesty, and for the choice you make each day." Takala acknowledged his words with a slight nod, then returned to her fabric. The conversation was over, but something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding perhaps, or the first fragile seedling of trust pushing through hard-packed soil. As Reed prepared for sleep, he found himself contemplating the day ahead with a strange mixture of dread and purpose. Whatever they discovered about Blackwell's operations, it would likely set them on a collision course with the Colonel, a confrontation 5 years in the making. Yet for the first time since Shadow Canyon, Reed felt something beyond guilt and regret driving his actions. There was a chance, however slim, to right an old wrong while preventing new ones. It wasn't redemption, he doubted such a thing existed for men like him, but it was purpose. And in the harsh reality of the territories, purpose was sometimes the only thing that separated those who survived from those who merely existed. Dawn came early, painting the eastern sky in bands of gold and crimson that gradually yielded to the clear blue of another desert day. Reed and Takala were already awake, preparing for the ride to the Apache trading camp. Hayes had promised horses and provisions, and true to his word, they found him waiting in the stable yard with 3 saddled mounts and packed saddlebags. "Light breakfast in the kitchen," the rancher greeted them. "Catherine's insisting. Then we'll head out." They ate quickly, fresh bread, eggs, coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, while Catherine packed additional food for their journey. Her concern was evident in the extra care she took, wrapping each item meticulously. "The trading band is led by a man named Nakohe," she explained as she worked. "He's known Thomas for many years. Reasonable, but cautious with strangers." "Will they speak with us?" Reed asked. Given the tensions, Catherine considered. "Nakohe values information and fair trade above politics. If you approach honestly, he'll listen." "And if he recognizes me as exile?" Takala questioned. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Hayes answered, entering the kitchen. "Ready to ride." Outside, they mounted the horses Hayes had prepared, sturdy quarter horses accustomed to long days and rough country. Reed appreciated the quality of the animal beneath him, responsive to the slightest pressure of knee or rein. Takala, too, showed comfortable familiarity with horsemanship, settling easily into the saddle despite her recent injuries. They rode east across Riverstone land, following a trail that wound through rolling grasslands interspersed with stands of juniper and pinyon. Hayes set a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, his rifle resting across his saddle in casual readiness that spoke of long experience in potentially dangerous country. As they rode, Hayes pointed out landmarks and boundaries where Riverstone property ended, where public grazing land began, where other ranchers' claims started. Reed listened with interest, building a mental map of the territory. Knowledge of the land had saved his life more than once in his scouting days. Takala rode slightly apart, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of threat or opportunity. Occasionally, she would indicate animal sign that the others had missed deer tracks crossing their path, the distant soaring of a hunting eagle, the barely visible trail of a coyote through the brush. By mid-morning, they approached a shallow valley, where cottonwoods marked the course of a seasonal stream now reduced to scattered pools in the late summer heat. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns above a camp of perhaps 20 wickiups, temporary Apache dwellings constructed of branches and hides. Hayes reined in his horse on a rise overlooking the camp. "We'll approach openly but slowly. No sudden movements. They'll have sentries watching already." Sure enough, as they descended into the valley, 2 mounted Apache warriors emerged from the trees to intercept them. Both carried rifles held casually but ready. They wore a mixture of traditional clothing and items acquired through trade. One had a cavalry hat, the other a cotton shirt beneath his buckskin vest. Hayes raised his hand in greeting, calling out in the Apache language. Though Reed didn't understand the words, the tone was clearly one of peaceful intention. The warriors responded, their posture relaxing slightly, though their eyes remained watchful. A brief conversation followed, with Hayes occasionally gesturing toward Reed and Takala. Finally, the older of the two warriors nodded and motioned for them to follow, leading them into the camp. Children paused in their play to stare curiously at the visitors. Women looked up briefly from their work, cooking tanning hides, weaving baskets, before returning to their tasks with the deliberate nonchalance of people accustomed to maintaining dignity under observation. A few men watched from doorways, their expressions unreadable. They were guided to a central clearing where an older man sat on a woven mat, a small fire burning before him despite the day's heat. His face was deeply lined, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as they approached. "Nakohe," Hayes greeted, dismounting and gesturing for Reed and Takala to do the same. The elder nodded in acknowledgement. "Thomas Hayes, it has been 2 moons since you visited." His English was clear, but accented learned through years of trading with settlers and ranchers. "Too long," Hayes agreed. "I've brought friends who seek information that may help your people." Nakohe's gaze shifted to Reed, taking in his appearance with the careful assessment of one who had learned to judge potential threats quickly. "The man carries a gun like a soldier, but wears no uniform." "I was a scout once," Reed admitted. "Not anymore." The elder's attention then turned to Takala, and his expression changed subtly, recognition flickering in his eyes. "And the woman, she bears the marks of the mountain people, those who do not welcome outsiders." Takala met his gaze steadily. "I am Takala of the mountain band. I walk alone now." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered at a respectful distance. Nakohe studied Takala for a long moment before speaking again. "The mountain people cast out few. Their loss is our gain if you come in peace." It was a surprisingly gracious acknowledgement of her exile status, offering neither pity nor condemnation. Takala inclined her head slightly, accepting the diplomatic response. "I come seeking truth about my people, who vanish in the night." Nakohe's expression grew grave. He gestured for them to sit across the fire from him, an invitation that carried significance beyond mere hospitality. Once they were seated, he spoke in measured tones. "You speak of the shadow takers. They come without warning, always at night. They take the young, the strong, leave the elders and small children." He passed a hand over the fire as if illustrating the disappearance. 4 bands have lost people, maybe 30 souls in all." "Have any escaped returned?" Hayes asked. Nakohe shook his head. "One only, a young man named Chano. He died of his wounds before he could tell much, but he spoke of silver mountains and chains." "Silver mines," Reed translated grimly. "Forced labor." "Who leads these shadow takers?" Takala asked directly. "Is it the one they call Blackwell?" A tense silence fell at the mention of the name. Nakohe's eyes narrowed slightly, but he answered with careful neutrality. "The white chief's name is not spoken by those who took Chano, but they wore the mark of the diamond and the letter that stands alone." "Diamond B Ranch," Hayes confirmed, "Blackwell's brand." Reed felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. The pieces aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Blackwell's mining interests, his need for cheap labor, his history of viewing the Apache as expendable obstacles to progress. "Where are these mines?" he asked. Nakohe gestured northward. In the high country, 3 days' ride. A place white men call Silver Peak. Once it was sacred land to the mountain people. He looked pointedly at Takala. Your people. The information hung in the air, heavy with implication. Silver Peak lay in rugged country north of Copper Springs, difficult to access, easy to guard, far from prying eyes. A perfect location for an operation that couldn't bear scrutiny. How many guards? Hayes inquired. How heavily defended? Nakohe spread his hands. Chano spoke of many rifles, 20 men perhaps more. Walls of stone and wood, difficult to approach unseen. Reed exchanged glances with Hayes and Takala, the unspoken question evident in all their expressions. What could 3 people possibly do against such odds? As if sensing their thoughts, Nakohe spoke again. My people cannot help you fight. We are few and must protect our children. But he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a folded piece of hide, spreading it on the ground to reveal a crude but detailed map. We can show you the hidden paths, the ways that even white scouts do not know. It was a significant offering, secret knowledge that the Apache had guarded carefully through years of conflict. Reed understood the gravity of the gesture, the trust it represented, despite generations of betrayal. Thank you, he said simply. We'll use this knowledge with respect. Nakohe nodded once, then turned to Takala. You walk a difficult path, woman of the mountain band. Exile among strangers seeking justice for those who rejected you. His weathered face softened slightly. Yet you honor your blood by this choice. Takala's composure wavered momentarily, a flash of emotion crossing her features before she controlled it again. They are still my people, even if I am not theirs. And the elder studied her for a long moment, then reached into another pouch and withdrew a small object, a carved wooden amulet on a leather cord. This belonged to my daughter, who walked to the spirit world many seasons ago. It protects the traveler on dangerous paths. He extended it toward Takala. Now, it is yours. The gesture clearly affected Takala deeply. She accepted the amulet with both hands, a sign of profound respect. I will honor it, she promised softly. With the exchange of information and gifts completed, their business with Nakohe was concluded. They rose, thanking the elder for his hospitality and counsel, and prepared to depart. As they mounted their horses, Reed noticed a change in Takala's demeanor, a new determination in the set of her shoulders, a clarity of purpose in her eyes. The knowledge that her people were being systematically taken for slave labor had transformed her personal quest for understanding into something larger. They rode away from the camp in thoughtful silence, each processing the implications of what they had learned. It wasn't until they crested the rise leading back to Riverstone territory that Hayes finally spoke. Well, he said grimly, now we know what Blackwell's been up to. Question is, what do we do about it? Reed considered carefully before answering. We need evidence, something concrete that can't be dismissed or explained away. Without that, it's just our word against a powerful man's. And how do we get this evidence? Takala asked practically. We see for ourselves, Reed decided. Silver Peak. We find the mine, confirm the Apache laborers document what's happening. Hayes looked skeptical. Risky undertaking. Blackwell's men won't hesitate to kill trespassers, especially ones gathering evidence against them. No choice, Reed replied. If we go to the authorities without proof, they'll do nothing. Blackwell has too much influence. They rode on, discussing strategies and possibilities. By the time they reached Riverstone Ranch in the late afternoon, a plan had begun to take shape, dangerous and uncertain, but the only path that offered any hope of exposing Blackwell's operation and freeing the captured Apache. As they unsaddled the horses in the stable yard, Hayes fixed Reed with a penetrating look. You understand what you're proposing means directly challenging one of the most powerful men in the territory. Not just about Shadow Canyon anymore. This is something bigger. Reed nodded, understanding the implication. This wasn't just about his personal history with Blackwell, nor even Takala's connection to the Shadow Canyon massacre. It was about preventing an ongoing atrocity, one that would continue to claim victims if left unchecked. Some things a man can't walk away from, he said simply. Not and still call himself a man. Hayes clasped his shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity. Catherine and I will help however we can. Riverstone stands with you both. As the rancher walked away to report to his wife, Reed turned to find Takala watching him, the wooden amulet now hanging around her neck. Her expression was thoughtful, assessing. In your sleep, she said quietly, you cry out for forgiveness. Now I understand why. Reed felt exposed by her observation, yet also strangely relieved. Some debts can't be paid, he replied. But that doesn't mean you stop trying. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement of a truth recognized. Without another word, she turned and walked toward their cabin, her stride purposeful and direct. Reed watched her go, struck by how much had changed in the brief days since he had found her collapsed in the desert. What had begun as a simple act of humanity, one life saved amid countless lost, had evolved into something far more complex and consequential. They were bound now not just by the tragedy of Shadow Canyon, but by a shared purpose that transcended personal grievance. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Reed found himself contemplating the days ahead with a mixture of dread and determination. They would ride to Silver Peak, would confront the evidence of Blackwell's crimes, would risk their lives to document what they found. And if they survived, they would face the even greater challenge of bringing that evidence to light in a territory where money and power often trumped justice. It was a fool's errand by any rational calculation. Yet as Reed finally turned toward the cabin where Takala waited, he felt a strange certainty that this path, however dangerous, was the one he had been seeking since the day he walked away from Shadow Canyon with blood on his hands and shame in his heart. Not redemption, perhaps, but purpose. And in the harsh reality of the territories, purpose was sometimes the closest thing to peace a man could hope to find. Preparations began at dawn the following day. In the small cabin they shared, Reed and Takala gathered supplies for the journey to Silver Peak: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, and the map Nakohe had provided. They worked in efficient silence, each focused on the task at hand, yet acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. Outside, the Riverstone Ranch stirred to life with its usual routines, cattle being moved between pastures, horses fed, fields tended. The normalcy of it struck Reed as almost surreal in contrast to their own preparations for a mission that might well prove fatal. Hayes arrived as they were finishing carrying additional supplies, a spyglass, 2 extra canteens, and a second revolver that he offered to Takala. "Can you use this?" he asked directly. Takala took the weapon, examining it with practiced hands that suggested familiarity. "Yes." Hayes nodded, unsurprised. "The Apache bands that trade with us have learned white man's weapons by necessity. Thought you might be the same." "My father taught all his children," she replied simply. "Said enemies' tools can become your own strength." Reed watched the exchange with interest. Takala had revealed little of her life before captivity and exile, but these brief glimpses suggested she came from a family of some standing within her tribe, perhaps leadership. Hayes spread Nakohe's map on the table, weighing down its corners with small stones. "I've been studying our route. If we follow this hidden trail, we can reach a ridge overlooking Silver Peak by tomorrow night. Good vantage point to observe the operation without being seen." Reed traced the path with his finger, noting the difficult terrain it traversed. "3 of us." "Catherine's staying," Hayes confirmed. "Someone needs to mind the ranch, and if we don't return—" He left the thought unfinished, but the implication was clear. Someone needed to survive to tell their story if things went wrong. They spent the next hour discussing strategy, how to approach the mine, what evidence to gather escape routes if discovered. Throughout, Reed found himself impressed by Takala's tactical suggestions. She thought like a scout, identifying weaknesses in defenses and natural features that could provide cover. By mid-morning, they were ready. Catherine joined them in the yard as they saddled the horses, bringing a final bundle of provisions and medicines. Her calm efficiency couldn't quite mask the worry in her eyes as she embraced her husband. 3 days, she said firmly. "If you're not back by then, I'm sending Miguel and Joseph to find you." Hayes kissed her forehead. "We'll be careful. Just reconnaissance. No heroics." Catherine turned to Reed and Takala. "That goes for both of you as well. The evidence is important, but your lives more so." Reed nodded, touched by her concern. In the brief time they'd spent at Riverstone, the Hayes had shown them more genuine humanity than he'd encountered in years of drifting. Takala accepted Catherine's words with a slight inclination of her head, her hand unconsciously touching the wooden amulet Nakohe had given her. "We will return," she said with quiet certainty. They mounted and rode north, following the main trail, until they were well clear of Riverstone land, then veering east into rougher country where Nakohe's hidden path began. Hayes led his familiarity with the territory, guiding them through what appeared to be impassable terrain, narrow ravines, steep-sided arroyos, game trails that vanished and reappeared like threads in a complex tapestry. By midday, they had entered a landscape few white settlers ever saw, a maze of slot canyons and eroded badlands where natural passages connected otherwise isolated valleys. The air hung heavy with heat, causing mirages to shimmer on distant horizons. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat, settling in the shade of a towering sandstone spire. As they shared the bread and dried meat Catherine had packed, Reed found himself studying Takala. She sat slightly apart, her gaze constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of threat. "You were trained as a scout for your people, weren't you?" he asked, the realization suddenly clear. She glanced at him, surprise briefly crossing her features before she composed them again. "How you know this, the way you move, how you read sign, your awareness of terrain." Reed had worked with many scouts, both white and native, during his military service. He recognized the particular vigilance that came from formal training rather than merely growing up in wilderness. Takala considered him for a moment before nodding. "My father was war chief. He taught me and my brothers. Said woman who cannot protect herself becomes victim." "Unusual for a girl to receive such training," Hayes commented. A hint of pride crossed her face. "My father was unusual man. Believed women had warrior spirits too." "He was right," Reed affirmed, thinking of her resilience in the face of exile and hardship. Something shifted in Takala's expression, a subtle softening that vanished almost immediately. She returned to her scanning of the horizon, but the rigid set of her shoulders had eased slightly. They continued northward through the afternoon, the terrain gradually rising as they approached the foothills that would eventually lead to Silver Peak. The hidden trail remained challenging but passable, winding through natural features in ways that would be nearly impossible to track. Reed understood now why the Apache had maintained their freedom for so long. Despite repeated military campaigns against them, this country offered endless places to disappear for those who knew its secrets. As dusk approached, they made camp in a small box canyon that offered natural protection, a single narrow entrance that could be easily watched, sheer walls that prevented approach from other directions, and a small seep that provided enough water to replenish their canteens. Hayes took first watch, while Reed built a small, nearly smokeless fire using dry branches from a dead juniper. Takala prepared a simple meal, mixing cornmeal with water and shaping it into flat cakes that she cooked on heated stones. The domesticity of the scene contrasted sharply with the danger of their mission, creating a strange intimacy among the three of them. As they ate, Hayes spoke of his early days in the territory, his arrival as a bitter young man seeking vengeance for his father's death, his gradual realization that hatred consumed the hater more than they hated his meeting with Catherine at a mission where she worked as a nurse. "Took her 2 years to agree to marry me," he recalled with a rueful smile. "Said I needed to decide whether I wanted to build something or destroy something. Couldn't do both." "Wise woman," Reed commented. "Smartest decision I ever made was listening to her." Hayes gazed into the small fire. "Built Riverstone from nothing together. Now I can't imagine any other life." Takala, who had been listening silently, asked, "You never wanted children?" A shadow passed over Hayes's face. "We had a son. Fever took him when he was 4. After that—" He shrugged, the gesture containing volumes of grief still carried after many years. "I am sorry," Takala said softly with simple sincerity. Hayes acknowledged her sympathy with a nod. "Life gives and takes. Can't control that. Only how we respond." He rose, stretching. "I'll take first watch. You two get some rest." As Hayes moved to the canyon entrance, Reed and Takala prepared their bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying fire. The night had grown cool, stars emerging in brilliant profusion across the darkening sky. Reed lay back, allowing his body to relax, while keeping his mind alert, the habit of years spent in potentially hostile territory. Across the fire, Takala settled into her blankets, but he could tell by her breathing that she wasn't sleeping either. After several minutes of shared silence, she spoke quietly. "The place we go, Silver Peak. It was sacred to my people." Reed turned his head toward her, able to make out her profile in the faint glow of embers. "Sacred how? Place of visions. Young men and women would fast there before becoming adults. Seek guidance from spirits." Her voice carried a distance that suggested she was remembering rather than simply recounting. "I went there before my 16th summer. Stayed 3 days without food or water." "What did you see?" Reed asked, genuinely curious. Takala was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally she said, "Wolf with 2 faces, one snarling, one calm. They fought each other until both bled." She paused. "Elder said it meant I would face great division within myself. Must find way to make peace between opposing natures." The image was striking and oddly fitting for a woman caught between cultures, between vengeance and forgiveness, between past and future. "Have you found that peace?" Reed asked. "Not yet." Her honesty was unflinching. "But each day I look for path." Reed considered her words, finding in them an echo of his own internal struggle. "We're not so different, you and I," he observed quietly. "Both trying to find our way after losing what defined us." Takala didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice held a complexity of emotion he hadn't heard before. "Perhaps, but you chose to leave your path. Mine was taken from me." The distinction was important and humbling. Reed acknowledged it with silence, recognizing that some gulfs couldn't be bridged by words alone. They drifted eventually into sleep, the small fire reduced to glowing coals. The night sounds of the desert coyote, calls, the rustle of small creatures, the whisper of wind through juniper, creating a timeless lullaby that had soothed countless generations of travelers in this ancient land. Morning arrived with the soft golden light that preceded full sunrise, painting the canyon walls in subtle gradations of amber and rose. Reed woke instantly, years of habitual vigilance bringing him to full alertness, without the gradual transition most people experienced. He found Hayes already up, tending a small breakfast fire, while Takala was nowhere to be seen. Reading his unspoken question, Hayes nodded toward the canyon entrance. "Scouting the trail ahead. Said she'd be back by the time coffee's ready." Reed joined the rancher by the fire, accepting a tin cup of strong coffee with gratitude. "How far to Silver Peak from here?" "If Nakohe's map is accurate, we should reach the observation ridge by nightfall." Hayes poured his own coffee. Course, that's assuming no unexpected company along the way. As if summoned by his caution, Takala appeared at the canyon entrance, moving with the swift silence that still impressed Reed. Despite his growing familiarity with her abilities, her expression was tense. "Riders," she reported without preamble. "6, maybe 7. Following our trail from yesterday." Hayes and Reed exchanged sharp glances. "Blackwell's men?" Hayes asked. Takala shook her head. "Apache, war paint." The news was unexpected and concerning. While they had Nakohe's blessing, other Apache bands might view their presence differently, especially with 2 white men traveling through traditional territories. "Hostile?" Reed asked, already mentally calculating defense options for their position. "Not attacking yet. Following only." Takala's expression revealed her own uncertainty. "But they wear markings of mountain band. My people." The significance wasn't lost on Reed. The mountain band had exiled Takala. Encountering them now complicated an already dangerous mission. "How far behind us?" 2 hours, maybe less. They know this land better than hidden trail shows. Hayes doused the fire with sand. "We need to move. Now." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, erasing all signs of their presence before mounting and continuing north along Nakohe's route. Takala led now, her knowledge of Apache tracking methods guiding their efforts to minimize their trail. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the foothills, narrow passages between towering rock formations, steep-sided ravines that required careful navigation, sparse vegetation that offered little concealment. By mid-morning, the sun beat down mercilessly, reflecting off stone surfaces to create an oven-like heat that sapped both humans and horses. During a brief stop to rest the animals in the shade of an overhanging cliff, Takala suddenly went still, her head tilted in the listening posture Reed had come to recognize. "They're closer," she said softly, "moving faster than us because of terrain knowledge." Reed scanned the surrounding landscape, seeing nothing but heat-shimmered rock and scrub. "Options," Takala considered briefly. "Continue to Silver Peak as planned, hope to lose them in higher elevations. Or," she hesitated. "Or," Hayes prompted, "I could speak with them, alone." And her expression remained carefully neutral, but Reed detected the tension beneath. "They might listen to women of their own blood." "Or they might kill you for violating your exile," Reed countered. "Too risky." "More risky to have angry warriors following us to Blackwell's operation," she replied logically. "Better to resolve now, away from mine." Hayes looked between them, then nodded slowly. "She has a point, Reed. If they're determined to follow us, better to know their intentions now than have them appear at the wrong moment later." Reed wanted to argue further, but recognized the tactical wisdom in their assessment. Still, the thought of Takala facing alone those who had rejected her, potentially violently, sat uneasily in his chest. "How would you do it?" he asked finally. "Leave clear trail for them to follow. Wait in open space ahead. You two hide within rifle range but remain unseen unless needed." Her plan was simple but sound. "They will send scouts first." "I will speak with scouts," Ask for parley with leader. The risk was substantial, but Reed could propose no better alternative. They continued forward until reaching a small mesa that matched Takala's requirements, open enough for a clear meeting, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would provide concealment for Reed and Hayes, while allowing them to cover her with rifles if necessary. As Takala prepared to take position in the center of the clearing, Reed caught her arm lightly. "Be careful," he said, surprised by the intensity of his concern. She met his eyes directly. "Always, M. Marshall." Then more softly, "Watch well. These are proud men, easily offended." Reed and Hayes concealed themselves among the rocks, rifles ready, but hidden from immediate view. Takala walked alone to the center of the clearing, where she sat cross-legged on the ground in the traditional posture of peaceful waiting. The vulnerability of her position, back straight, hands empty and visible, entirely exposed to approach from any direction, made Reed's throat tighten with anxiety. They didn't wait long. Within 20 minutes, 2 Apache scouts materialized from the rocky terrain as if formed from the landscape itself. They approached cautiously, rifles held ready, but not aimed directly at Takala. Reed kept his weapon trained on the nearest scout finger, resting lightly beside the trigger, while Hayes covered the other. Takala remained motionless as the scouts approached, speaking only when they were within comfortable conversational distance. Reed couldn't understand the Apache language, but the exchange seemed measured rather than hostile. After several minutes, one scout retreated, while the other remained watching Takala. Another quarter-hour passed before a larger group appeared, 5 warriors led by an older man whose bearing suggested authority. He wore traditional Apache clothing adorned with symbols of rank and accomplishment, his face painted with vertical stripes that Reed recognized as indicating a war chief. Takala rose smoothly as they approached her posture, respectful but not submissive. The leader halted a few paces from her, studying her with an unreadable expression. Words were exchanged, the chief's tone stern, Takala's responses measured but firm. The conversation continued for several minutes, occasionally becoming more animated. At one point, Takala gestured toward the north, toward Silver Peak, and the chief's reaction seemed sharp, almost angry. She responded with equal intensity, pointing to the amulet around her neck. When the chief spoke again, his manner had changed, less confrontational, more considering. He stepped closer to Takala, said something that caused her to bow her head briefly, then placed his hand on her shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of blessing or acknowledgement. The tension in Reed's body eased slightly as he recognized the signs of peaceful resolution. The chief and his warriors conferred briefly, then, to Reed's surprise, settled on the ground in a circle with Takala joining them. It appeared they were preparing for a longer discussion. Hayes caught Reed's eye and nodded toward a position where they could observe while remaining hidden. They retreated carefully, finding a shaded outcropping that offered both concealment and a view of the meeting below. "Looks like she's convinced them of something," Hayes observed quietly. Reed nodded his respect for Takala's diplomatic skills growing. "Question is, what happens next?" The answer came sooner than expected. After perhaps 30 minutes of discussion, the Apache group rose. The chief embraced Takala briefly, a gesture that clearly held significance, before he turned and beckoned toward Reed and Hayes's hiding place. "He knows we're here," Reed realized, unsurprised. Apache warriors were consummate trackers and had likely been aware of their presence all along. "Time to meet our new friends," Hayes said, rising and stepping into view with his rifle held non-threateningly at his side. Reed followed, maintaining a similar non-threatening but vigilant posture. They descended to the clearing where Takala waited with the Apache band. As they approached, she stepped forward to make introductions. "This is Chief Nagai of the Mountain Band," she said formally. "My father's brother, my uncle." The revelation startled Reed. He had known Takala came from a family of standing, but not that she was directly related to the tribe's leadership. It explained much about her bearing and skills while raising new questions about her exile. Chief Nagi, these are Reed Thornton and Thomas Hayes, men of honor who fight against those who steal our people. The chief studied them with penetrating dark eyes, set in a face weathered by decades of sun and wind. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. My niece says you seek to free our people from the Silver Mountain, that you have evidence against the white chief called Blackwell. Reed responded carefully. We seek evidence first. Once we have it, we hope to bring justice against those responsible. Nagai's expression remained impassive. Justice. White man's word with many meanings. He glanced at Takala before continuing. My niece has convinced me of your intentions. She says you, Reed Thornton, were at Shadow Canyon but tried to prevent the killing. Reed felt the familiar weight of that memory. I failed, he admitted simply. The chief considered him silently before responding. Failure in a good cause is still honorable. Success in an evil one brings only shame. He turned to include Hayes in his gaze. We will help you reach Silver Peak unseen. 3 of my warriors will guide you. They know paths even Nakohe's map does not show. The offer was unexpected and valuable. Reed glanced at Takala, whose expression held a complex mixture of emotions, pride, sadness, perhaps a touch of vindication at having her judgment affirmed by the uncle, who had presumably been party to her exile. We're grateful for your help, Hayes responded formally, but I'm curious why you would trust us with this task rather than undertake it yourselves. Nagai's expression darkened. We have tried. 2 warriors sent to scout the mine never returned, and our band grows smaller. Too few fighters remain to mount proper attack. He gestured toward the north. Besides, this is white man's evil. Perhaps it requires white man's methods to expose. The pragmatism was both surprising and refreshing. Reed had encountered many tribal leaders during his scouting days, but few who balanced traditional values with such clear-eyed assessment of changing realities. What changed regarding Takala? Reed asked directly, unable to contain his curiosity about her status. She said she was exiled by your people. The question was perhaps too blunt. Hayes shot him a warning glance, but Nagai seemed unperturbed. Exile was never my wish, he replied, his gaze moving to his niece with what appeared to be genuine regret. But Council of Elders demanded it after her return from captivity. Old ways, old fears. He straightened slightly. Now, with our people stolen for Silver Mountain, old ways must sometimes bend to survive. It wasn't a complete rescinding of her exile. Reed could see that in Takala's carefully controlled expression, but it represented a significant shift in her relationship with her tribe. A door once firmly closed had been cracked open, allowing at least the possibility of eventual return. The practical arrangements were made quickly. 3 warriors would accompany them to Silver Peak, guiding them along secret paths that would allow observation of the mining operation without detection. The rest of Nagai's band would continue their own mission of locating other Apache who had been taken gathering information that might prove useful in freeing the captives. As preparations were completed, Nagai took Takala aside for a private conversation. Reed couldn't hear their words, but he saw the intensity in both their expressions, the way Takala's composure wavered briefly before she regained it. When they finished speaking, the chief touched her forehead in what was clearly a blessing before rejoining his warriors. They departed within the hour, the 3 groups moving in different directions, Nagai and most of his band continuing their search for information about missing Apache, while Reed, Takala, Hayes and their 3 guides headed directly toward Silver Peak. The warrior guides, introduced as Tarak Lencho and Kla, led them on a route even more circuitous and difficult than Nakohe's map had indicated. They traversed dry stream beds, narrow game trails, and occasionally what appeared to be sheer rock faces, but actually contained nearly invisible handholds and ledges. Throughout, the warriors moved with the silent efficiency that had made the Apache such formidable opponents in warfare, communicating primarily through subtle hand gestures and maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. By late afternoon, they had entered the higher elevations of the mountain range that culminated in Silver Peak. The vegetation changed, with the altitude piñon and juniper giving way to ponderosa pine, and small stands of aspen that quivered in the slightest breeze, their leaves flashing silver and green in dappled sunlight. They made camp in a small protected valley building, no fire despite the increasing chill of the higher elevation. The Apache warriors shared pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat fat and berries that provided substantial energy in small portions, while Hayes contributed jerky and hardtack from their own supplies. As they ate this sparse but satisfying meal, Kla, the eldest of the guides, unfolded a small piece of hide on which he had sketched the layout of the mining operation. Using sticks and stones, he created a three-dimensional representation of Silver Peak, indicating the mine entrance, guard positions, worker housing, and the best observation points for their reconnaissance. "Many guards," he explained in limited English, placing small stones to represent sentries. "Change at dawn, midday, dusk, most alert at changing times." Reed studied the model, carefully memorizing the details. How many Apache held there? Kla conferred briefly with the other warriors in their language before responding. 20, maybe 30. Men and women. Strong ones only. He made a digging motion. "Work all day in tunnels. Sleep in pen like animals." His expression darkened with controlled anger. "Any white workers?" Hayes asked. Kla nodded. "Few. Bosses only. Men with whips." The image was grimly familiar: forced labor under brutal conditions, a practice supposedly abolished, but persisting in remote areas, where law was whatever the powerful declared it to be. Reed had seen similar operations during his travels through the territories, though rarely on the scale this one appeared to be. "Best approach?" he inquired, focusing on the immediate tactical considerations. Tarak, the youngest warrior, pointed to a ridgeline overlooking the mining compound. "Here, good view, hidden by trees, close enough to see faces." They spent the remaining daylight hours refining their plan. At first light, they would approach the observation point, spend the day documenting the operation, then retreat to safety before attempting to determine their next steps. The evidence they gathered would be crucial. Without it, any accusations against Blackwell would be dismissed as the claims of a disgruntled ex-scout, an exiled Apache woman, and a rancher with no legal authority. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped significantly, they wrapped themselves in blankets and settled close together for warmth. Reed found himself between Hayes and Takala, the three Apache warriors forming a similar group nearby. Despite the danger of their mission, Reed felt a strange contentment in this moment of shared purpose with people he had come to respect. "What did your uncle say to you?" he asked Takala quietly. "Before we left." She was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. Finally she said, "He asked forgiveness for not preventing exile. Said council feared I brought bad spirits back from captivity." Her voice remained steady, but Reed sensed the emotion beneath. "He said when this is finished he will challenge council. Speak for my return." "That's good, isn't it?" Reed asked, carefully aware of the complexity such an offer might hold for her after years of rejection. "Perhaps." Her tone was measured. "But I am not same woman who left. Not sure I belong there anymore." The admission surprised him. "Where do you belong, then?" Takala turned slightly to look at him, her profile silvered by starlight. "I will know when I find it." She paused, then added softly, "Some birds cannot return to old nest, must build new one." The metaphor struck Reed as particularly apt. He too was searching for a place to belong after leaving behind the identity that had defined him for so long. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "you won't have to face it alone. Not unless you want to." She didn't respond verbally, but in the darkness he felt her hand briefly touch his, a fleeting contact that conveyed more than words could have. Then she turned away, preparing for sleep, leaving Reed to ponder the significance of that momentary connection and the unexpected path that had brought them to this mountain on the eve of confronting a powerful enemy. Dawn arrived crisp and clear, the air so thin at this elevation that each breath felt sharp in the lungs. They rose before first light, consuming a cold breakfast while reviewing their plan one final time. The Apache warriors would guide them to the observation point, then maintain a security perimeter, while Reed, Hayes, and Takala documented the mining operation. They moved out in single file, Claw leading, followed by Takala, Reed, Hayes, and the other two warriors bringing up the rear. The forest provided good cover, dense stands of pine and fir, whose needled branches broke up their silhouettes, and whose soft carpet of fallen needles muffled their footsteps. After an hour of steady climbing, they reached a ridgeline that offered their first distant view of Silver Peak. Even from several miles away, the scale of the operation was evident, a scar of cleared forest and exposed earth marring the mountainside with the regular geometric shapes of buildings clustered near what must be the mine entrance. "Big operation," Hayes murmured. "Blackwell's not doing this alone. Must have investors' political protection." Reed nodded grimly. "All the more reason we need solid evidence. This goes beyond just Blackwell." They continued along the ridgeline, occasionally dropping below it, when the trail became exposed until they reached the observation point Tarak had identified. It proved ideal for their purposes, a natural depression, rimmed with boulders and trees, that offered both concealment and clear sightlines to the mining compound below, now less than half a mile distant. Reed unpacked the spyglass Hayes had provided, extending it carefully to study the operation in detail. What he saw confirmed their worst expectations. The compound consisted of several buildings arranged around a central yard, offices, barracks for the guards' equipment storage. Near the mine entrance stood a crude pen constructed of logs driven vertically into the ground and bound together with heavy chains, a human corral, where Apache workers were apparently held when not laboring in the tunnels. Even as he watched, a group of about 20 Apache emerged from the mine entrance, their clothing filthy, their movements betraying exhaustion. They were herded toward the pen by guards carrying rifles and whips, their treatment no different from that of livestock being driven to pasture. "See for yourself," Reed said quietly, passing the spyglass to Takala. She looked for a long moment, her body becoming increasingly rigid as she observed the treatment of her people. When she lowered the glass, her expression was controlled, but her eyes blazed with contained fury. "Children of my mother's sister are there?" she said tightly. "Cousins I thought dead or fled to reservation." Hayes took his turn with the spyglass, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the scene. Blackwell himself present. Reed reclaimed the glass, scanning the compound carefully. "Don't see him. Probably doesn't dirty his hands with daily operations. But—" He focused on a man emerging from the office building, tall, military bearing, giving orders to the guards with the confident expectation of immediate obedience. "That's Captain Ellis, Blackwell's second-in-command during Shadow Canyon, now apparently running this operation." The confirmation of direct links between Blackwell's Shadow Canyon and this forced labor camp solidified their suspicions into certainty. This wasn't merely opportunistic exploitation of indigenous people, it was the continuation of a systematic campaign against the Apache that had been disguised as military necessity 5 years earlier and now wore the mask of economic development. They spent the day documenting everything they could observe: guard rotations, treatment of workers, mining procedures, supply wagons arriving and departing. Hayes, who had experience with mining operations, estimated the silver yield based on the volume of ore being processed, concluding that the profit must be substantial to justify the risk of such an obviously illegal enterprise. "This isn't small-scale banditry," he observed. "This is organized crime with corporate backing," Reed agreed. The operation's scale suggested Blackwell had financial partners, probably Eastern investors, seeking returns on the territory's mineral wealth without concerning themselves with the methods used to extract it. As the afternoon waned, they prepared to withdraw to a safer position for the night. Their documentation was thorough. Hayes had made detailed sketches of the compound layout, while Reed had compiled notes on personnel procedures and the treatment of Apache workers. Combined with Takala's ability to identify specific individuals being held against their will, they had assembled compelling evidence of Blackwell's crimes. They were preparing to depart when Kla returned from his scouting position with urgent news. "Riders coming," he reported tensely. "Many. From south." Reed immediately raised the spyglass, focusing on the trail leading up from the direction of Copper Springs. A column of horsemen wound their way toward the mining compound, at least 15 riders, well armed and moving with the discipline of military or paramilitary forces. "Blackwell," he confirmed grimly, recognizing the lead figure even at this distance. "Must be making an inspection visit. Probably why Ellis has been pushing the workers so hard today, preparing to show progress." The development complicated their plans. They had intended to regroup, and determine the best authorities to approach with their evidence. Blackwell's presence created both risk and opportunity: risk of discovery if they remained, opportunity to document his direct involvement if they stayed. "We should go," Hayes advised. "We have enough evidence. No need to take additional chances." Reed was inclined to agree, but Takala spoke before he could respond. "No, we stay. Must see Blackwell with my own eyes. Must have proof he directs this evil." Her determination was understandable, but potentially dangerous. Reed exchanged concerned glances with Hayes, who shrugged slightly, deferring to Reed's judgment in this tactical situation. After a moment's consideration, Reed decided, "We stay until dusk, document Blackwell's involvement, then withdraw under cover of darkness. But at first sign of discovery, we leave immediately." "Agreed." Takala nodded reluctantly, accepting the compromise. The Apache warriors melted back into the forest to maintain their security perimeter, while Reed, Hayes, and Takala settled in to observe Blackwell's arrival at the mining compound. The colonel rode through the gates like a returning conqueror, his bearing regal despite the dust of the trail. Ellis greeted him with a salute, old habits apparently dying hard, before leading him on a tour of the operation. Through the spyglass, Reed could see Blackwell's satisfaction as he inspected the mined ore, his indifference as he passed the pen, where exhausted Apache workers watched with carefully blank expressions. "He treats their suffering like it's nothing," Reed murmured, disgust evident in his tone. "Just another resource to be exploited." "Man believes in his own superiority," Hayes observed. "Sees others as tools for his ambition, nothing more." Takala said nothing, her gaze never leaving Blackwell as he moved through the compound. Reed could almost feel the intensity of her focus, like heat radiating from banked coals. As sunset approached, Blackwell's inspection concluded with what appeared to be a celebratory meal for the white staff in the main office building. Lights glowed in the windows, while guards maintained their patrols outside, occasionally prodding Apache workers who moved too slowly in their evening routines. "Time to go," Reed decided, noting the deepening shadows. We've seen enough. They gathered their documentation and prepared to withdraw, moving carefully back from the ridgeline to rejoin the Apache warriors waiting in the forest below. The plan was to descend to their previous campsite, rest briefly, then continue through the night to put maximum distance between themselves and Silver Peak before Blackwell's forces realized they had been observed. They had nearly reached the rendezvous point when a warning call, so perfectly mimicking a night bird that Reed almost missed its significance, alerted them to danger. They froze, hands moving to weapons as Claw materialized from the shadows. "White men," he whispered urgently. "6, maybe 7, coming up trail, armed." The news was alarming. These were likely guards from the mining compound, perhaps sent to check the perimeter as a routine security measure with Blackwell present. Either way, their path would intersect with the group's planned route of withdrawal. "Options?" Hayes asked tersely. Reed considered quickly. "Can't risk a firefight, would bring the entire compound down on us. Need to evade, circle around them." Claw nodded agreement. "Follow, quietly." He led them on a circuitous route through the forest, moving perpendicular to the approaching guards before doubling back on a parallel track that would eventually reconnect with their intended path. The maneuver required absolute silence and careful foot placement. Any snapped twig or dislodged stone might betray their presence. They had almost completed the evasion when disaster struck. Hayes, bringing up the rear, caught his foot on an exposed root and stumbled, sending a small cascade of loose stones rattling down the slope. The sound, though not loud, carried clearly in the still mountain air. Immediately, voices rose from the direction of the guard patrol, sharp commands, followed by the metallic clicks of weapons being readied. Flashlight beams probed the darkness, sweeping through the trees toward their position. "Run," Reed ordered softly. "Now." They abandoned stealth for speed, trusting to darkness and forest cover to shield them from accurate fire as they fled downslope. Behind them, shouts confirmed the guards had detected their movement and were in pursuit. A rifle cracked the bullet, whining harmlessly through branches overhead. The 3 Apache warriors split from the main group, a prearranged tactic to divide the pursuers' attention. Reed, Hayes, and Takala continued straight ahead, moving as quickly as the difficult terrain allowed, occasionally catching glimpses of flashlight beams cutting through the trees behind them. They reached a small stream and followed it downward, using the water to mask their tracks, while the rushing sound covered the noise of their passage. The pursuit seemed to recede slightly, suggesting the tactic was working, but Reed knew their advantage was temporary. By morning, Blackwell would have men searching every possible escape route from the mountain. After nearly an hour of continuous flight, they paused in a small clearing to catch their breath and assess their situation. Hayes, despite his age and the earlier stumble, had kept pace admirably, though his breathing was more labored than the others. Takala appeared virtually untouched by the exertion, her movements as fluid and controlled as when they had begun. "Think we've lost them for now," Reed whispered, straining to hear any sounds of pursuit over the pounding of his own heart. "But they'll organize a proper search at first light." "We need to keep moving," Hayes agreed. "Get as far from Silver Peak as possible before dawn." Takala, who had been scanning the surrounding forest with keen eyes, suddenly tensed. "Someone comes," she warned, her hand moving to the revolver Hayes had given her. Reed and Hayes immediately took defensive positions, weapons ready as they peered into the darkness. A soft whistle, another bird call that wasn't a bird, preceded the appearance of Tarak, the youngest of their Apache guides. "Others captured," he reported grimly. "Kla and Lencho drew guards away, were surrounded. Told me to run, warn you." The news hit hard. The 2 warriors had sacrificed themselves to give the others a chance to escape a debt that could not be easily repaid. "Blackwell will question them," Reed said, thinking aloud. "They won't break easily, but eventually..." He will learn of Riverstone. Hayes finished the thought. Of our involvement. The implication was clear. They couldn't return to the ranch. It would be the first place Blackwell's men would look once they extracted information from the captured Apache. Catherine and the ranch hands would be in danger. "We need to warn your wife," Reed told Hayes. "Get her to safety before Blackwell's men arrive." Hayes nodded grimly. "Catherine will have sent Miguel and Joseph looking for us by now, as she promised. If we can intercept them on the trail, we might still reach Riverstone ahead of Blackwell." It was a slim hope, but better than none. They set out immediately, Tarak guiding them on the most direct route toward Riverstone territory. The night passed in a blur of continuous movement, brief rests when absolutely necessary, constant vigilance for signs of pursuit. By dawn, they had descended from the mountains into the lower foothills, the landscape gradually transitioning back to the more familiar terrain of juniper and piñón. They kept to cover whenever possible, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted by searching riders. Mid-morning brought both encouragement and concern. As they crossed a dry wash, Takala spotted fresh horse tracks, 2 riders heading north toward Silver Peak. "Miguel and Joseph," Hayes confirmed after examining the sign. "Catherine must have sent them looking for us yesterday when we didn't return as scheduled." "Can we catch them?" Reed asked. "Warn them before they ride into trouble." Hayes studied the tracks, assessing their age. "Perhaps. They're moving cautiously, probably a day ahead of us. If we push hard, we might intercept them before they reach Silver Peak." And they resumed their journey with renewed urgency, following the tracker's trail, while remaining alert for any sign of Blackwell's men. The day grew hot, water supplies dwindled, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that lives depended on their speed and endurance. Late afternoon brought them to a narrow canyon where the tracks they followed disappeared into the shadowed depths. Hayes halted, his expression concerned. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "Miguel wouldn't take this route. Too confined, too easily ambushed." Reed scanned the canyon walls, noting the perfect positions for hidden riflemen. "Think they were forced this way. Or the tracks are false," Takala suggested. "Made to lead us into trap." The possibility hadn't occurred to Reed, but it made tactical sense. If Blackwell's men had captured Miguel and Joseph, they might have compelled them to leave a trail specifically designed to lure Hayes and the others into an ambush. "We circle around," Reed decided. "Find higher ground, observe the canyon from above before committing." They backtracked and began a difficult ascent of the nearest ridge, seeking a vantage point that would allow them to survey the canyon without exposing themselves. The climb was grueling in the afternoon heat, but essential to avoid walking blindly into potential danger. From the ridgetop, the canyon lay exposed below like a great stone serpent winding through the landscape. Reed carefully scanned its length through the spyglass, searching for any sign of human presence. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the typical features of a desert canyon: scattered vegetation, eroded rock formations, the dry stream bed cutting through its center. Then, as he adjusted the focus slightly, details emerged that confirmed their suspicions. Near the canyon's narrowest point, where high walls created a natural choke point, he spotted the faint reflection of sunlight on metal, a rifle barrel hastily concealed among the rocks. "Ambush," he confirmed grimly. "At least one gunman in the narrows. Probably more I can't see." Hayes's expression hardened. "Miguel and Joseph," Reed continued his careful scan, eventually locating 2 figures seated against the canyon wall. Hands apparently bound behind them, a guard standing nearby. "Found them, alive but captive, being used as bait." The situation was grim, but not hopeless. They now knew the trap existed and could plan accordingly. The question was how to rescue Hayes's men without walking into Blackwell's snare. "I count at least 5 positions where gunmen could be hiding," Reed reported, completing his survey of the canyon, "plus the guard with the prisoners, maybe others I can't see." "Too many for direct attack," Hayes concluded. "We'd be cut down before reaching Miguel and Joseph." Takala, who had been studying the canyon with her own keen eyes, spoke up. "There is another way." She pointed to a barely visible game trail that wound down the opposite canyon wall, approaching the prisoner's position from behind, rather than through the narrows. Difficult path, but possible. One person could reach them, while others create distraction. Reed followed her, indicating finger, noting the treacherous descent the trail would require, nearly vertical in places, with minimal handholds and virtually no cover. It would be a challenging route, even for an experienced climber, and extremely dangerous under fire. "I'll go," Takala said, simply reading his thoughts. "Lightest, most experienced on such paths." Reed wanted to object. The danger was extreme, and if she were spotted during the descent, she would be completely exposed to enemy fire. But he recognized the logic of her proposal. Her Apache upbringing had given her skills in this terrain that neither he nor Hayes could match. "We'll need a substantial distraction," he said instead, accepting her volunteer. "Something to draw all attention to the canyon entrance while you make the descent." Hayes's expression was grim but determined. "I have an idea about that, but it will put us at considerable risk." "What did you have in mind?" Reed asked. "We ride openly into the canyon, appear to be falling for their trap. Draw all eyes to us while Takala makes her approach from behind. When she's in position to free Miguel and Joseph, we create confusion, firing, shouting enough chaos to cover their escape." It was a bold plan, perhaps. Too bold, verging on suicidal for Hayes and Reed. But Reed could see no better alternative that offered any chance of rescuing the captives. "Risky," he acknowledged. "But it might work if timed perfectly." They spent the next hour refining the details. Takala would begin her descent immediately, allowing ample time to navigate the difficult trail before Hayes and Reed made their diversionary approach. They established signals, a bird call when she reached position near the prisoners, a rifle shot as the signal for her to make her move, while they created maximum distraction. As sunset approached, painting the canyon walls in deepening shades of crimson and purple, they prepared to put their plan into action. Takala removed her boots for better grip on the rocky descent, tucked the revolver securely at her waist, and accepted a knife from Tarak that would be used to cut the prisoner's bonds. Before she left, she turned to Reed, her expression uncharacteristically open. "If this fails," she said quietly, "remember what I told you about the 2 wolves. Choose which to feed carefully." Reed understood her meaning. She was reminding him not to let vengeance consume him if things went wrong. "Same to you," he replied. "Be careful." She nodded once, then slipped away with Tarak, who would guide her to the starting point of her dangerous descent, while Hayes and Reed prepared for their own role in the rescue attempt. As darkness gathered fully, Reed and Hayes mounted their horses and began the approach to the canyon entrance. They rode openly, as if unaware of the ambush awaiting them, their pace unhurried but steady. Reed felt the familiar tension that preceded combat, the heightened awareness, the careful regulation of breath, the mental preparation for whatever might come. "Catherine will be wondering what's happened," Hayes commented as they rode, his voice pitched normally as if they were having a casual conversation. "Hope this works so I can tell her in person rather than having her hear it from someone else." Reed understood the sentiment, the desire to fulfill promises made, to return safely to those waiting. It struck him suddenly that he too had someone waiting, someone whose opinion of his fate mattered. The realization that Takala had become that person in his life came as a surprise, yet felt entirely natural. They reached the canyon entrance and continued inward, the walls rising around them like great sentinels standing guard in the gathering darkness. Reed's every sense was alert for the first sign that the ambush was being triggered, the metallic sound of a hammer being cocked, the subtle shift of a hidden rifleman adjusting position, the tension in the air that presaged violence. They had penetrated perhaps 200 yards into the canyon when Reed caught the faint sound they had been waiting for, a perfect imitation of a canyon wren's descending call. Takala had reached her position near the prisoners. Hayes gave the briefest of nods, acknowledging that he too had heard the signal. They continued forward another 50 yards, approaching the narrowest part of the canyon where the ambush was concentrated. Reed's hand moved casually to his rifle, loosening it in its scabbard, while maintaining the appearance of unsuspecting travelers. When they reached the precise spot they had selected during planning, Hayes suddenly reined in his horse. "Now!" he shouted, drawing his revolver in a smooth motion and firing 3 rapid shots into the canyon wall where they had spotted one of the hidden gunmen. Reed's rifle was in his hands, instantly aimed and firing at another concealed position before the echo of Hayes's shots had died away. The element of surprise gave them a momentary advantage. 2 of Blackwell's men fell before the others realized their ambush had been detected. The canyon erupted into chaos, muzzle flashes from multiple positions, bullets whining off stone as Reed and Hayes took cover behind a large boulder, continuing to fire and create maximum distraction. Their horses, trained for ranch work rather than combat, had bolted at the first shots, but were unlikely to go far in the confines of the canyon. Behind the thunder of gunfire, Reed strained to hear any indication that Takala had successfully reached the prisoners. A shout of alarm from that direction suggested she had at least one guard had detected her approach. Reed fired deliberately in that direction, hoping to provide additional cover for her rescue attempt. The firefight continued for several minutes, a deadly exchange that gradually shifted in favor of Blackwell's more numerous forces. Reed and Hayes found themselves pinned down, able to return fire, but not to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to multiple shooters. "Running low on ammunition," Hayes reported grimly after another exchange. "Can't hold them off much longer." Reed was facing the same limitation. He had perhaps 5 rounds remaining, not enough to clear a path through the ambushers. Their diversionary plan had succeeded in drawing attention away from the prisoners, but had left them in an increasingly untenable position. Just as the situation seemed most desperate, a new sound rose above the gunfire, a high, ululating Apache war cry that echoed off the canyon walls with spine-chilling intensity. It came not from behind them where Takala had been, but from the canyon rim above, where multiple voices now joined in the ancient battle call. Confusion spread among Blackwell's men as arrows began raining down from above, finding targets with uncanny accuracy in the dim light. Reed risked a glance upward and saw silhouettes along the ridgeline, at least a dozen Apache warriors firing down into the canyon with bows and a few rifles. "Nagai," he realized. "Takala's uncle must have followed us, brought warriors to help." The unexpected reinforcement changed the dynamic of the battle immediately. Blackwell's men, now caught between Reed and Hayes's position, and the Apache above, began a disorganized retreat toward the canyon entrance, several falling to arrows or bullets in the process. In the midst of the chaos, Reed spotted movement near where the prisoners had been held. 3 figures were working their way along the canyon wall toward their position, Takala with Miguel and Joseph behind her, moving as quickly as the latter's condition allowed. "Cover them!" Reed ordered Hayes, rising to provide suppressing fire as the trio approached. His remaining bullets were spent with careful precision, forcing the nearest of Blackwell's men to keep their heads down, as Takala and the ranch hands reached the relative safety of the boulder. Miguel had a bloody gash across his forehead, but seemed otherwise intact. Joseph's condition was worse. He limped heavily, supported by Takala, his face pale with pain or blood loss. "Blackwell's men caught us yesterday," Miguel reported tersely. "Questioned us about Riverstone. Tried to make us lead them to you." Hayes checked Joseph's injury, a bullet wound to the thigh, painful, but not immediately life-threatening if infection could be prevented. "You did well," he assured both men. "Now we need to get out of here." The Apache war cries continued from above, as Nagai's warriors maintained their barrage, effectively pinning down the surviving ambushers and preventing pursuit. Taking advantage of the covering fire, their small group began a fighting retreat toward the canyon entrance, Hayes and Miguel supporting Joseph, while Reed and Takala provided protection. They had nearly reached safety when a single rider appeared at the canyon mouth, silhouetted against the night sky, a tall figure whose military bearing was unmistakable, even in the dim light. "Blackwell." Reed breathed instinctively, raising his rifle before remembering it was empty. The colonel sat his horse with perfect composure, despite the chaos of battle around him, apparently surveying the scene with the detached interest of a chess player observing an endgame. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly above the diminishing gunfire. "Marshal Reed Thornton," he called, "still interfering in matters beyond your understanding, I see. Some habits die hard." Reed stepped forward, placing himself between Blackwell and the others. "And you're still killing Apache for profit. Some habits are worse than others." Blackwell's laugh held no humor. "Profit, progress, two sides of the same coin. The territory moves forward on the backs of those who must be subjugated. It's the natural order." "Natural order is about to hang you for murder and kidnapping," Reed countered. "We've documented everything at Silver Peak. The forced labor, the conditions, your direct involvement. It's over, Blackwell." Something dangerous flickered in the colonel's eyes, a calculating assessment followed by cold decision. His hand moved to his side where a holstered revolver waited. "I think not," he said softly. "Dead men document nothing, and there will be no witnesses left when this is finished." Before he could draw, however, an arrow whispered through the darkness and buried itself in the shoulder of Blackwell's gun arm. He jerked backward, his horse rearing in alarm, as more arrows followed, forcing him to retreat from the canyon entrance. Taking advantage of the moment, Reed urged the others forward. "Go now. Get to the horses if you can find them, or continue on foot. Head east toward Nagai's camp." They emerged from the canyon to find 3 of their horses had indeed remained nearby, apparently unwilling to stray far from their riders despite the gunfire. Hayes and Miguel helped Joseph onto one mount, while Takala took another. Reed was preparing to climb onto the third when a shot rang out, and something struck him, hard in the side, spinning him half around with the impact. Blackwell had recovered enough to fire his revolver left-handed, the bullet finding its mark despite the awkward angle. Reed staggered, feeling the warm wetness of blood spreading beneath his fingers as he pressed them to his side. "Reed?" Takala's cry seemed to come from a great distance as darkness encroached on the edges of his vision. He forced himself to remain standing, turning to face Blackwell one final time. The colonel was already raising his revolver for a second likely fatal shot when multiple arrows and bullets struck him simultaneously. Nagai's warriors had reached positions overlooking the canyon entrance. Blackwell fell from his horse, his body crumpling to the ground with a finality that required no confirmation. Reed felt strong hands supporting him. Hayes and Takala on either side helping him onto the remaining horse. Pain lanced through his torso with every movement, but he managed to stay conscious as they began moving away from the canyon, leaving behind the sounds of continued fighting as Nagai's warriors eliminated the last of Blackwell's ambushers. They rode through the night, a grim procession focused solely on putting distance between themselves and the canyon. Reed drifted in and out of consciousness, aware at times of Takala's voice, urging him to hold on, of Hayes's concerned glances, of the steady rhythm of hoofbeats beneath him. The wound in his side burned like fire with each breath, but he fought to remain awake, knowing that surrendering to unconsciousness might mean never waking again. Dawn found them approaching a small encampment nestled in a protected valley, Nagai's temporary headquarters. Apache sentries guided them in where Reed and Joseph were immediately tended by the band's medicine woman. The bullet had passed through Reed's side without striking vital organs, but blood loss and the risk of infection remained serious concerns. As his wound was cleaned and bound with herbal poultices, Reed drifted into fevered dreams where past and present merged into surreal landscapes. He saw Shadow Canyon again, but this time he succeeded in stopping the massacre. He saw Blackwell falling from his horse not once but countless times in endless repetition. And throughout, he felt Takala's presence, sometimes visible, sometimes merely sensed, a constant in the shifting dreamscape. He woke fully on the third day, his fever broken, to find Takala sitting beside him in the small wickiup where he had been placed. She was sewing something, a shirt, perhaps her hands moving with the same efficiency they brought to all tasks. "You're still here," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. She looked up, and for the first time since he had known her, a genuine smile transformed her features, brief but radiant, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Where else would I be, Marshal?" she replied, setting aside her sewing to offer him water. "Someone must keep you from dying stupidly." The familiar tartness in her tone was reassuring proof that however much had changed, some things remained constant. He drank gratefully the cool water, soothing his parched throat. "Joseph," he asked when he had finished. "Healing well. His wound was cleaner than yours." She adjusted the blanket covering him with careful hands. "Hayes returned to Riverstone yesterday to bring Catherine here. They will arrive soon." Reed absorbed this information, piecing together the events that had occurred during his incapacity. "And Blackwell. The mine." Takala's expression grew more solemn. "Blackwell is dead. His men scattered. Nagai's warriors freed the Apache from Silver Peak." A flash of satisfaction crossed her features. "Silver Peak is abandoned now. My people have reclaimed sacred ground." It represented a significant victory, not just the rescue of captured Apache and the end of Blackwell's forced labor operation, but the restoration of traditional lands to their rightful stewards. Yet Reed knew the broader systems that had enabled Blackwell's crimes remained largely intact. "The evidence we gathered," he asked. "Hayes still has it." Takala nodded. "Says he will take to territorial governor when you are stronger. Names of other men involved, details of operation. Says some are powerful, but evidence is strong." Reed wasn't naive enough to believe all those implicated would face justice. Money and influence would shield many from consequences. But exposing the truth was a necessary first step, and perhaps some accountability would result, however imperfect. As strength gradually returned over the following days, Reed received the full account of what had transpired after he was wounded. Nagai had indeed followed them from their meeting, concerned about his niece's safety and suspicious of Blackwell's activities. When fighting erupted in the canyon, his warriors had intervened decisively, eliminating most of Blackwell's men and liberating the captives from Silver Peak in a coordinated attack. Hayes and Catherine arrived as promised, the latter taking charge of medical care for Reed and Joseph with her characteristic efficiency. The Hayes would return to Riverstone once their patients were fit to travel, rebuilding what Blackwell's brief reign of terror had disrupted. The question of what came next hung unspoken but ever present as Reed's recovery progressed. Nagai had formally invited Takala to rejoin the mountain band, Her exile effectively ended by her role in exposing Blackwell's operation and freeing their people. Yet, she had not immediately accepted her decision, apparently as complex as the path that had brought her to this moment. On the evening before Hayes and Catherine planned to depart for Riverstone, Reed found Takala sitting alone outside the camp, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. He joined her carefully, his wound still tender, but healing well under Catherine's care. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the beauty of the desert evening enfolding them like a shared blanket. Finally, Reed spoke the question that had been forming in his mind since regaining consciousness. "Have you decided about returning to your people?" Takala considered before answering, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Nagaye says council welcomes me now, that my actions have washed away old fears." A hint of irony colored her tone. Amazing how success changes minds. "But," Reed prompted, sensing her hesitation, "but I am not same woman who was exiled, cannot pretend to be." She turned to look at him directly. 5 years I walked alone, changed me, made me see world differently." Reed understood completely. His own journey since Shadow Canyon had similarly transformed him, making return to his former life impossible, not because others wouldn't accept him, but because he was no longer the person who had lived that life. "What will you do then?" he asked. Takala's expression softened slightly. "Hayes offered place at Riverstone, for both of us. Says ranch needs good horse trainer and garden keeper." The inclusive nature of the offer for both of us wasn't lost on Reed. It represented not just employment, but a potential future, a place to belong, a community that would accept them despite their complicated histories. "Sounds like a good offer," he said carefully, not wanting to presume her choice. "It is." She studied him thoughtfully. "What about you, Marshall? Where does your path lead now?" Reed considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Blackwell was dead, the immediate threat ended. The evidence they had gathered would be delivered to authorities, perhaps leading to some measure of justice for those who had enabled his crimes. The debt Reed had carried since Shadow Canyon wasn't fully paid. Perhaps it never could be, but he had taken meaningful action toward restitution. "Not sure exactly," he admitted, "but I'm thinking Riverstone might be a good place to find out, if I'm welcome there." Takala's expression remained composed, but something in her eyes softened further. "I think you would be welcome," she said quietly. Then, with the hint of a smile, "Someone must keep watching your back. You attract too much trouble alone." The gentle teasing contained a deeper truth. They had come to rely on each other, to trust each other, to see in each other possibilities that neither had imagined when they first met in that sun-baked desert basin. Their connection, forged in shared danger and mutual respect, had evolved into something neither could easily define, but neither wished to relinquish. "Partners, then," Reed suggested, extending his hand in the formal gesture of agreement. Takala regarded his offered hand for a moment, then surprised him by ignoring it completely and leaning forward to kiss him briefly, a feather-light touch of lips that conveyed more than any handshake could have. "Partners," she agreed, as she drew back her expression both serious and tender. "On this path, wherever it leads." The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in deepening purple and the first glimmering stars. In the Apache camp behind them, fires were being lit, casting warm pools of light where people gathered in the familiar rhythms of community. Ahead, the vast landscape stretched toward distant horizons, containing both memory and possibility, past and future, held in precarious balance. Reed felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, not the absolution he had once sought, nor the redemption he had doubted was possible, but something equally valuable, the chance to move forward with purpose, to build, rather than destroy, to create meaning from the raw materials of regret and hope. He reached for T'Challa's hand in the gathering darkness, finding it waiting for his. Together, they watched night claim the land, two souls who had found in each other not completion, but complement the warrior and the peacemaker, vengeance and forgiveness, shadow and light creating between them a space where healing might finally begin. The journey ahead would not be easy. The territory remained a place of conflict and change, where forces of greed and progress continued their relentless advance. Justice for Blackwell's crimes would be imperfect at best, with many of his powerful associates likely escaping significant consequences. The future of the Apache and other indigenous peoples would continue to hang in precarious balance as the nation expanded westward. But for tonight, those larger concerns could wait. Tonight was for acknowledging what had been lost, what had been found, and what might yet be built on the borderlands of forgiveness, that liminal space where the past is honored, but not permitted to dictate the future, where new paths emerge from the ashes of old certainties, and where two unlikely companions might forge a bond strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead. As the first stars emerged fully overhead, Reed and T'Challa rose by mutual accord and walked back toward the welcoming fires of the camp, their shadows merging into one as they moved together into whatever tomorrow might bring.